few seconds, you will hear the heavy rain sound as I am hearing while driving. But no worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. Late at night, when the rest of the world is asleep, it's easy for all the unsaid words and lingering stress to flood in. We spend so much energy keeping up with the fast-paced rush of life that we forget how to just breathe. Let this story be your gentle boundary against the chaos out there. I'm Deb, and this is Shadowed Slumber. If these quiet tales help you find a moment of peace, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Settle in under the covers, take a deep breath, and rest easy knowing nothing out there can harm you here. Let's step into the story together. Hey, come sit with me for a while. Whatever the day was, you can put it down now. You've been enough today. What I have for you tonight is dark and quiet, and it's going to take a little while to tell. That's exactly what I need you to give me. A little while. This is Warden, and for the next while, you don't have to hold anything by yourself. If you want, tell me down in the comments what kept you awake tonight. I read those, even the ones I don't answer. All right, let's get you somewhere else for a while. There is a sound a foghorn makes right before it cuts out that I have never heard anywhere else and never told anyone about. A kind of catch in the throat of it, like the horn itself is swallowing before it goes quiet. I heard it 4 times in 22 years of piloting ships through Coronaros. I only understood what it meant the 4th time. By then it was already too late to matter, though I did not know yet that it had ever been early enough to matter at all. I retired from harbor piloting 6 years ago, and I still live 2 miles from Coronaros, close enough that on still nights I can hear the channel buoys if the wind sits right. People assume I stayed for the water, the way old sailors do. I stayed because leaving felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit. And because some part of me still believed, foolishly, that staying close was a kind of penance, as if proximity could substitute for the thing I actually owed. I was a harbor pilot for 22 years, the woman who came aboard incoming ships in the dark and guided them through the narrowest, most fog-choked stretch of coastline in the county, a job that exists, because Coronaros has claimed 11 vessels since anyone started keeping count, its currents running contrary to what any chart shows, its fog rolling in with a specificity local sailors learn to read the way you'd read a person's mood. I was good at it. I was, for most of those 22 years, the best pilot working that stretch of coast. And I want you to understand that this is not pride talking. It is the specific, load-bearing fact that made everything after possible. I came to the job the ordinary way, apprenticed under a pilot named Harlan Deese, who had run the Narrows for 30 years before me, and who told me, on my first night aboard, that the channel would teach me its rules faster than he ever could, and that my job was mostly to listen. I did not fully understand what he meant by that for years, assuming he meant the ordinary listening any competent pilot does, engine pitch, the particular slap of water against a hull that means the current has shifted. I understand now that he meant something closer to what I would eventually learn the hard way, that the Narrows communicated in a language mostly made of absence, The things that did not sound right, the silences that sat where sound should have been. The job worked like this. A ship radioed in from 3 miles out, and I went aboard in a small boat, in whatever weather the night had decided to bring, and I stood on the bridge and told the captain when to turn and when to hold, reading the fog and the tide and the particular sound the water made against the rocks at Ennet Point. A sound I had learned so thoroughly over 2 decades that I could have piloted that channel blind, and on the worst nights more or less did. I want to tell you about the smell first, because it is the thing that has stayed with me longest, longer than the sound. Longer even than what I saw. Coro fog does not smell like ordinary sea fog. Ordinary sea fog smells like salt and diesel, and, faintly, like the inside of a boot that has been wet too many times. Coro fog, on the nights it came in wrong, smelled like a struck match a half second after the match goes out. That particular sulfur and smoke sweetness, except there was never a match anywhere near the water, never any explanation for it that the 6 or 7 old-timers I eventually asked could offer beyond a shrug and a change of subject. I asked Harlan Deese about it once, years into the job, describing the smell as carefully as I could and watching his face for whatever he might let slip. He told me, after a long pause, that he had smelled it exactly twice in his own 30 years, and that both times, within the month, a boat had gone down in water that should not have been dangerous that night, and that he had made a private rule, after the second time, never to take a call on a night the fog carried that smell. A rule he passed to me without further explanation, the way you pass along a superstition you have decided to treat as fact, because the alternative has cost you too much already. I did not understand, at the time I first heard it, how carefully I would eventually need that rule, or how completely I would fail to keep it. He died 4 years before the Corrigan Hope, of an ordinary heart condition, in an ordinary hospital bed, and I remember sitting with him near the end and wanting badly to ask whether the rule had ever been tested the way mine eventually was, whether he had ever answered a call he should have let ring through the fog, unanswered. I did not ask. He was tired, and the question felt cruel to bring to a dying man, and I have regretted that restraint more than almost anything else, because I will now never know whether what happened to me was unique, or whether it is simply what happens, eventually, to any pilot who works that channel long enough to be trusted with its worst nights. I noticed the wrong fog for the first time on a Tuesday in October, 4 years into the job, guiding a cargo ship called the Anders Leifel through on a run I had made probably 200 times by then. The fog came in thick around Ennet Point, thicker than the forecast had promised, and it carried that struck match smell, and somewhere underneath the ordinary radio chatter I heard once, faint, a voice that was not on my frequency asking for a heading. I did not think much of it. Channels cross sometimes. I gave the Anders Lyle its turn, brought it through clean, and thought no more about it for 3 years. I remember, on the drive home that night, stopping at the all-night diner on the harbor road the way I did most mornings after a run, and sitting in a booth by the window with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm by the time I finished it, watching the fishing boats come in as the sky lightened, and feeling, for those 20 minutes, entirely and simply glad to be exactly where I was, doing exactly what I did. I mention this because it is the last time I remember feeling that way. without any static underneath it. And because I did not know yet that I should have paid closer attention to how ordinary and unguarded that morning felt, how completely I trusted the water that had, the night before, already begun asking me questions I had not yet learned to hear as questions. The second time was worse, though I did not understand yet that it was the same thing happening again, rather than a new and separate strangeness. A fishing trawler, small enough that it should never have been running the Narrows at night without a pilot, radioed in a distress call from a position that put it dead center in the worst of the current engine trouble. 2 crew aboard, visibility down to nothing. I went out in the launch myself rather than waiting for the ship to come to me, because that was the kind of pilot I had built a career on being. The one who went out into the weather rather than waiting for it to pass. I found nothing. I ran the search grid twice, radioed the distress frequency 6 times, and got only the struck match smell thickening around the launch. And once, that same catch in a foghorn's throat, cutting off mid-note somewhere out in the fog, where no vessel of record was logged as present that night. I reported an aborted rescue, no vessel located, and filed it under the category every pilot eventually develops for the things the water does, that nobody wants written down plainly. The category I now understand I had been quietly filling for 3 years without letting myself notice its shape. For a long stretch after that second night, close to 8 months, the fog behaved itself. It came in on schedule, smelled the way fog is supposed to smell. And I began slowly to let myself believe that whatever had produced those 2 strange nights had passed, the way a bad run of weather eventually breaks. I threw myself back into the ordinary rhythm of the job with something close to relief. Took on extra shifts, trained a junior pilot through her first solo run, and found, for those 8 months, that I could go whole weeks without thinking about the struck match smell at all. This is, I think now, the most dangerous shape the whole thing ever took. More dangerous than any single foggy night, because it let me walk back into the third call, believing I had already survived the worst the Narrows had to offer, when in fact it had simply been waiting for me to stop being careful. The third time, I did something I have never told a single person, not my former harbor master, not my own sister, not anyone in 6 years of retirement. I answered. The call came on the distress frequency at 1 in the morning on a night thick with the wrong fog. A voice, faint, requesting a pilot, position given as a spot in the Narrows where I knew, with total professional certainty, that no channel existed deep enough for anything larger than a rowboat. I stood in the pilot station for a long moment before deciding anything, the radio crackling with that same faint request, repeating on a 40-second interval. And I remember telling myself, absurdly, that the coffee maker in the corner needed descaling. Some small mundane fact about the equipment that had nothing to do with anything, a thought I clung to for the length of about 3 repetitions of the call before I finally reached for my jacket. I had been telling myself, off and on, for 3 years, that the wrong fog was nothing. Ordinary equipment strangeness, crossed frequencies, and some part of me was still telling myself that even as I climbed into the launch alone, I should have logged it and let it go, the way I had the first time. Instead, I took the launch out alone, against every protocol I had spent 22 years enforcing on other people, because some part of me, The part that had built an entire identity around being the pilot who goes out could not let a call go unanswered. And because, if I am honest with you now, from this safe distance, some part of me wanted to finally see whatever it was that kept almost arriving and never quite did. I found a ship this time. I want you to understand that I use the word ship deliberately and carefully, because everything about my professional vocabulary insists it should not apply, and I have spent 6 years failing to find a better one. It sat low and dark in the off and at point, running. No lights, and when I called out across the water, a voice answered requesting a heading, and the voice had the exact cadence of a captain I had piloted for a dozen times over the years. A man named Foss Idris, who had retired from the merchant service 4 years earlier, and, as far as I knew that night, was safely ashore somewhere 60 miles south, asleep in his own bed. I gave the heading. I have turned that decision over more times than I can count, and I still do not fully know why I gave it, except that giving headings was the entire architecture of who I was, the one thing my hands and my voice knew how to do without hesitation. And a voice asking for one, in Foss Idris's exact cadence, pulled that response out of me before the rest of my mind had finished registering how wrong the whole shape of the night had become. The ship moved. I watched it go, low and dark, following the line I had given it, straight toward the rocks at Ennet Point rather than through the channel, and I understood, too late by exactly the length of that single decision, that I had not been guiding a ship to safety at all. It did not strike the rocks. I want to be plain with you here, the way the worst of it deserves plainness rather than more language. It reached the rocks, and it did not stop, and it did not break apart, and it simply continued moving forward into stone that should have ended it. The way water continues past a place where water is not supposed to be able to go. And then the fog closed over where it had been, and the struck match smell thinned, and the foghorn at Ennet Point, which had been sounding its ordinary interval all night, caught in its throat once, and went silent for 40 minutes before resuming, as though nothing had happened at all. I sat in the launch for a long while after that, engine idling, my own hands resting flat on my knees, the way you rest them when you are trying to convince your body that stillness is a choice rather than a failure of nerve. I remember, oddly, thinking about my kitchen at home, the specific chip in the enamel of my favorite mug, a small, mundane fact that had nothing to do with any of this, and I let myself sit with that thought for as long as it would hold, because it was the only thing available to me that made any sense. I did not cry. I did not radio anyone. I simply sat in the fog until the shaking in my hands settled enough to steer, and then I brought the launch home. I'd not report this one. I told myself, driving the launch back to the station, my hands shaking too badly to properly log the run, that I had responded to a false alarm, equipment malfunction, nothing more. And I believe this the way you believe anything you cannot afford to disbelieve, which is to say I made myself believe it with the specific discipline of a professional who has spent 22 years training her own reactions into whatever shape the job required. 3 weeks later, a real ship went missing in the Narrows. A fishing vessel called the Corrigan Hope, 4 crew aboard, last radio contact placing it exactly where I had given my heading that night. Gone without a distress call, without wreckage, without anything. The Coast Guard's 6-day search turned up beyond an oil slick that later testing could not conclusively match to the vessel at all. I remember the day the search was called off, standing on the dock with the other pilots and the harbor master, all of us looking out at water that gave back nothing, and I remember one of the younger pilots, a man named Seth Halloran, who could not have been more than 26, saying that the Narrows had a way of taking what it wanted and never showing its work, a comment he meant as ordinary sailor's fatalism, and that landed on me like an accusation I had no way to answer without confessing everything. I said nothing. I have thought about that silence more than almost anything else from those weeks. The specific cowardice of standing among people who trusted my judgment completely and letting them keep trusting it. I went to the memorial the families held that spring, standing at the back of a small church 2 towns over, close enough to see the framed photographs of all 4 crew set on a table near the altar, close enough to hear the Corrigan Hope's captain's mother say, in a voice worn thin from crying, that at least the sea was quick, that at least her son had not suffered. I stood through the entire service with that sentence lodged somewhere behind my ribs, unable to tell her that quick was not the word I would have chosen, that I did not actually know what word belonged to whatever had happened to her son in that fog, only that I had handed the door open myself and then driven home and made myself a cup of tea. I sat through the inquiry that followed, answered every question about routine patrol and standard protocol, and said nothing about the ship that was not a ship, the voice that was not Foss Idris's voice, though it had worn his cadence perfectly, or the heading I had given to something I already suspected, even then, was not asking for rescue at all, but for permission. I told myself, in the weeks after, that confessing would accomplish nothing beyond ending my own career, and giving the Corrigan Hope's families a story no inquiry board would believe, an explanation that felt, at the time, like protecting them, and that I now understand was mostly protecting myself. Here is what I understand now. From this distance, in this kitchen, 6 years retired and 2 miles from water, I can still hear on still nights. Every ship I ever failed to properly warn away from Corro Narrows across 22 years. Every close call the fog produced, and I somehow, through skill or luck or the particular arrogance of being very good at a dangerous job, managed to guide clear, was not actually cleared. It was postponed, moved sideways into whatever accounting the Narrows keeps, and the debt did not vanish. It simply waited for a night when I would answer a call I should not have answered, and give a heading I had no authority to give, and settle, all at once, everything my skill had spent 2 decades deferring. I retired 8 months after the Corrigan Hope, earlier than I had planned, citing nerves and age to a harbor master who accepted the explanation without pressing, since pilots retire early often enough that nobody thinks to ask further. I did not tell him or anyone that I no longer trusted my own hands on a radio, that every heading I gave in those last 8 months felt like a small negotiation with something I could not name, a constant, quiet arithmetic running underneath every ordinary shift, wondering which of the ships I guided clear that season were actually clear, and which were simply being moved further down, whatever list the water kept. Those last 8 months were the hardest work I ever did, harder than any single storm, or any 3 in the morning distress call across 22 years, because the difficulty was not in the weather or the water at all, but in the simple daily act of standing on a bridge and doing my job competently while carrying a certainty nobody else on that ship could see. I trained myself to sound steady. I trained myself to give clean, confident headings in a voice that betrayed nothing. And I did this well enough that not one captain I worked with in those final months ever asked whether something was wrong, which I have come since to understand as both a professional triumph and the loneliest accomplishment of my career. The Corrigan Hope's 4 crew are not the only names on that ledger, though they are the only ones I can point to with anything resembling certainty. I do not know how many others there might be, scattered across 22 years of nights I guided vessels clear of danger. I now suspect I was never actually clearing, only rerouting, the way a good pilot reroutes traffic, rather than stopping it. I know what I owe, even if I cannot tell you the exact sum, and I know I owe it specifically, not generally, not as some vague maritime guilt, but as a debt with a channel and a depth and a name I gave to something that was never Foss Idris at all. Some nights I take out an old logbook, one of the 6 I kept across my career, and I read back through the routine entries from those 22 years. Ordinary headings, ordinary weather notes, dates that meant nothing to me at the time and mean everything now. And I try to work out which entries were real rescues and which were the Narrows quietly collecting on something I did not know I had already agreed to. The logbook never tells me. It was never designed to record the kind of accounting I am trying to do with it now, and I have come to understand that this not knowing is itself part of what I owe, a permanent uncertainty that will not resolve, no matter how many times I read the same 22 years of entries. My sister asks me, sometimes, why I never took up sailing again for pleasure. The way most retired pilots do, small boats, calm weekends, nothing like the work. I tell her my knees are not what they were, which is true, and also not the reason. And she has stopped pressing the question the way people eventually stop pressing questions they sense are guarding something larger than the stated answer. I have never told her about Foss Idris's voice on the radio, or the ship that reached the rocks and did not stop, or the particular arithmetic I still run some mornings, standing at my kitchen window with the strait just visible past the tree line, counting back through 22 years of clean passages, and wondering, with a specificity that never quite resolves into certainty, how many of them were actually clean. Sometimes, on the calmest evenings, when the water sits flat and gray and gives no indication of anything beneath it, I find myself almost able to believe that the whole account has closed, that whatever I owed was collected in full on the night the Corrigan Hope went down, and nothing further is expected of me. I do not trust that feeling. It arrives too easily, too gently, in exactly the shape of relief I remember feeling in that diner booth all those years ago, and I have learned, the hard way, to be suspicious of any comfort that asks nothing of me in return. I still hear the foghorn some nights, the ordinary one, the real one at Annette Point, doing its ordinary job. And on the nights, the fog comes in with that particular sweetness, that Struck's match smell with nothing nearby to have struck it. I lie awake and listen for the catch in its throat, the half second where it swallows before it goes quiet, and I wait, the way I have waited 6 years now, to find out whether the accounting considers me finished. or whether somewhere out past a net point. In water, I spent 22 years learning better than my own hands. Something is still waiting for me to answer one more call. There is a rule on the Talvera Range hut circuit that no search and rescue handler writes down. Though every one of us learns it inside the first season, usually from someone older, who delivers it the way you deliver a diagnosis, plainly, once, and then never brings it up again. If your dog alerts on a hut the registry shows as empty, you radio it in, you note the GPS coordinate, and you do not go inside. You wait for a second team. You never go in alone. And you never, under any circumstance, go in on the strength of your dog's nose, without a second handler confirming. I broke that rule 3 years ago, and I am telling you this now from a kitchen table 200 miles from the nearest ridge, with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that has long since gone cold, because I need you to understand, before I tell you what happened, that I already knew the rule. I did not break it out of ignorance. I broke it because of something that happened the season before, something I have never told another handler on this range. And because that earlier failure had carved a specific shape into me, that the mountain, when the moment came, fit itself into perfectly. I have handled search dogs for 11 years, the last 6 of them on the Talvera Range, a stretch of alpine backcountry threaded like a hut-to-hut circuit that draws close to 4,000 hikers a season and loses, on average, 2 or 3 of them to weather, falls, or simple disorientation badly enough to require a search. My dog, a 7-year-old Malinois named Juno, has a find rate that other handlers on the team still bring up when they introduce me to newer volunteers. And I want you to understand that this is not vanity. It is the specific, load-bearing fact that made everything after possible. The same way a good pilot's confidence is the thing that eventually gets tested hardest. I came to this work the way most handlers do, through a dog first and a mission second, training Juno from 14 months old with a trainer named Odell Braxton, who had run search dogs on this range for close to 25 years before his own retirement. Odell was the one who first told me about the rule. On my second season, standing outside Corrigan Hut on an ordinary training day, with nothing more sinister in the air than the smell of pine and cold granite, and I remember thinking at the time that it sounded like the kind of superstition every closed professional community eventually accumulates. A story passed down more for cohesion than for any real protective function. I did not ask him where the rule came from. I understand now that this not asking is its own kind of tradition on this range. The same silence I would eventually pass forward myself. The season before the one I need to tell you about, we were called to a report of an overdue hiker near Corrigan Hut, the fourth shelter on the circuit's northern loop, a stone structure built in the 1930s that sleeps 12 and sits at 9,600 feet in a bowl that fogs in fast and without much warning. Juno alerted at the hut door, hard, the full-body L stillness she gives when she has something, and the hut's registry, checked by radio against the ranger station's log, showed no occupants recorded for that structure in 6 days. I followed the rule. I radioed it in, marked the coordinate, and held position 40 minutes until a second team arrived, per protocol, for the thing every senior handler had ever told me. We found nothing. An empty hut, cold stove, No sign anyone had passed through in days, and Juno's alert written off in the debrief that followed as scent carried up from an earlier hiker's gear left in a cache box near the door. This explanation satisfied the team. It did not satisfy Juno, who spent the following 3 weeks refusing to settle near that particular section of trail on subsequent training runs. And it did not, in the end, satisfy me, because 9 days after that search, a different hiking party found a body in a crevasse a half-mile from Corrigan Hut. A young man who had been missing since 2 days before our search, whose last recorded position, based on a partial trail log entry, put him passing directly by that hut on the night Juno alerted. I remember the evening after that debrief, sitting on the tailgate of my truck at the trailhead, with Juno's head resting against my knee, both of us simply watching the light go out of the sky over the ridge, and feeling for those 20 minutes a kind of settled relief that had nothing to do with the case itself, only the ordinary satisfaction of a long day finally ending. I mention this because it is the last time I remember feeling that particular, uncomplicated calm on this range, and because I did not yet understand how much I would come to miss the version of myself who could feel it. I have never been able to prove that he was inside when we searched, and I have never been able to prove that he wasn't. The coroner's estimate placed his death within a window that could have gone either way, but I carried that uncertainty for a full year, the specific, gnawing shape of it, the sense that I had followed a rule correctly. And a young man died anyway, possibly because I had followed it, and that uncertainty was still sitting in me, unresolved, when the call came in the following season for a missing hiker near Doyle's Rest, the 7th hut on the southern loop. The missing hiker was a 24-year-old named Cassidy Ames, overdue by 14 hours. Last confirmed contact, placing her somewhere between Doyle's Rest and the next shelter, a stretch of exposed ridge that turns dangerous fast when weather moves in, which it had that afternoon, dropping visibility to almost nothing and temperatures down into a range that made every hour of delay a genuine calculable risk to her survival. Her mother was on the radio channel the entire search, patched through from the ranger station, her voice cracking through the static every time we gave an update. And I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to excuse what I did next. I am telling you because it is true, and because the warmth I felt toward that woman, a stranger I never met, is as real a part of this story as anything that happened on the mountain. Juno alerted at Doyle's Rest at 6:40 in the evening. Full stillness. The same alert as Corrigan Hut a year earlier. And the registry, when I radioed it in, came back clean. No occupants logged. Hut marked empty since the season's early closure, 2 weeks prior. My second team was 50 minutes out, delayed by the same weather that had Cassidy Ames somewhere out on that exposed ridge, running out of whatever margin her body had left. And I stood at that door with Juno pressed against my leg, the wind coming in sideways hard enough to sting. I ran the math the way I imagine every handler runs it in that particular kind of moment, weighing a protocol against a stopwatch that only exists in your own head. No official countdown anywhere, just the private escalating certainty that every minute spent waiting is a minute. A 24-year-old woman does not have to spare somewhere out in that fog. I thought about Corrigan Hut, and the specific gnawing shape of a year, spent not knowing whether my caution had cost a man his life, and I thought about a mother's voice on the radio, cracking through static, asking, every few minutes, whether there was any news yet. I thought about all of this in something closer to 8 seconds than any considered deliberation, and I made the decision that has cost me everything I have not yet finished paying. I went in alone. The hut was empty, in the way empty rooms are empty when nothing living has occupied them in some time. Cold stove, undisturbed dust on the sill, and, for a moment, standing there with Juno's continued, insistent alerting confusing me further rather than resolving anything. I believed I had simply repeated the same mistake as the year before, chasing a false signal while a real girl froze somewhere out on the ridge. I called out Cassidy's name into the dark of the main room, my headlamp catching nothing but old bunk frames and a stack of split wood someone had left for the season's next occupant, and for perhaps 10 seconds I stood there in a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears, wondering if I had just made the exact same error twice, in opposite directions, both times costing precious minutes a real person somewhere on that ridge did not have to spare. And then I heard it, from the loft space above the main room, a sound I can only describe as someone shifting their weight the way a person does when they have been sitting very still for a long time and have finally decided to move. And I called up, my voice cracking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, asking if anyone was there. A voice answered. It said Cassidy's name, in Cassidy's own voice. The exact pitch and cadence I had heard described by her mother, not 20 minutes earlier over the radio. Weak, relieved. Saying she had gotten turned around in the fog, and found the hut, and hidden in the loft, get out of to the wind. And every part of my training told me this was exactly what a frightened, hypothermic hiker sounds like, disoriented, grateful, alive. I climbed the loft ladder, each rung cold enough through my gloves that I registered it distinctly, the particular ache of gripping metal in that kind of temperature, a small mundane detail I found myself fixating on, as though it could anchor me to something ordinary, while the rest of the situation tilted further from anything ordinary at all. I want to tell you plainly what I found there, the way the worst of it deserves plainness, rather than more language. I found no one. The loft was empty, dust undisturbed on the floorboards, and the voice, which had been coming from directly above me only seconds before, was now coming from below, from the main room I had just left, still calling my name in Cassidy's voice, patient, unhurried, waiting for me to come back down. I did not go back down right away. I stood in that empty loft for a long moment, Juno's barking from the doorway below, sharpening into something I had never heard from her in 6 years of working together. And I made myself breathe, made myself think about the specific mundane fact of my own truck parked 3 miles down at the trailhead, the ordinary shape of a Tuesday that this was supposed to have been, the exact make and model of the tires I had been meaning to replace before the season started. Anything at all that was not the sound still coming patiently from the room beneath my feet. I had been telling myself for a full year that I would not make the same mistake twice. I understood, standing in that loft, that I had simply made a different one, in the opposite direction, and that both mistakes had somehow arrived at the same door. The voice changed once, near the end, in a way I have never been able to properly describe to another living person, going from Cassidy's exact cadence to something that no longer bothered pretending, low and wrong, and patient in a register that had nothing to do with fear or cold. Still using her name, still shaped like a sentence a frightened person might say, but carrying underneath it something that made every hair on my arms rise even through 3 layers of technical fabric. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in how total it was, that whatever was in that hut had never been asking for rescue at all. It had been asking for permission, the same permission every empty hut alert on this range had probably been asking for, going back decades. And that the unwritten rule I had broken existed precisely because some handler long before me had already learned this the hard way, and had spent the rest of their career making sure nobody else needed to learn it twice. I got out. I will not tell you exactly how, partly because the specifics blur in my memory in a way I no longer trust to report accurately, and partly because some part of me believes, even now, that describing the exact mechanism of my escape is itself a kind of invitation I am not willing to extend twice. What I can tell you is that the ladder felt longer going down than it had going up, that the cold air rushing in through the hut's open door, when I finally reached it, felt like the first genuinely clean thing I had touched in what might have been 5 minutes, or might have been considerably longer, since I have never been able to reconcile my own sense of the time elapsed with what my radio log later showed. What I can tell you is that Juno was still at the door when I came down the ladder, that she did not follow me inside, though every instinct in 6 years of training said she should have, and that this, more than anything else that's happened that night, told me everything I needed to know about what had actually been waiting for me in that loft. She met me at the threshold with a level of relief I had never seen from her before or since, pressing her full weight against my legs hard enough that I nearly lost my footing in the doorway, and I remembered dropping to my knees right there in the snow, both arms around her, my face pressed into her fur, breathing in the ordinary living smell of a working dog after a long shift, wet fur and trail dust, and something faintly like the kibble in her vest pocket, the most grounding thing I have ever smelled in my life. We did not go back inside. I radioed my position, reported the hut clear, made no mention of what I had actually encountered, and walked the half-mile down toward the ridge where the second team, arriving late but not too late, would find Cassidy Ames alive within the hour. Cassidy Ames was found 3 hours later by the second search team, alive, hypothermic but stable, a half-mile from Doyle's Rest, in exactly the kind of exposed position that made the delayed response nearly cost her everything. She had never been inside that hut. She did not know Doyle's Rest existed, as anything other than a name on a trail map she had glanced at once before setting out. I met her once, briefly 6 weeks later, at a small gathering the ranger station held to thank the search teams involved, and I remember shaking her hand and feeling, in that ordinary contact, an almost unbearable weight of everything I was not saying. She had recovered well by then, her color back, her voice steady, in a way it clearly had not been in the days right after the search, and she thanked me specifically, having been told I was part of the team that located her, and said with the particular brightness of someone freshly grateful to be alive, that she hoped she'd never need people like me again, but was glad we existed. I said something appropriately modest in response. I do not remember what. I remember mostly the strange doubling of standing in a warm room full of relieved people, while some other part of me was still, in some sense I have never fully resolved, standing at the bottom of that loft ladder. listening to a voice that had already stopped pretending it belonged to her. I have never told her mother, who called me personally 2 weeks after the search to thank me for my part in it, what actually happened at that hut while her daughter was freezing a half-mile away. Because I do not know how to tell a grateful mother that the reason her daughter's rescue took 3 additional hours is that her rescuer spent 20 minutes of that window climbing a ladder toward a voice that was never her daughter at all. She cried on that call softly, the specific relieved crying of someone whose worst imagined outcome did not come true. And I sat with the phone against my ear and let her cry, and said the things you say, and did not tell her a single word of what I am telling you now. Here is what I understand now. From this kitchen table, 3 years and 200 miles removed from that loft, the rule exists because it works, and it works because someone, sometime before any of us currently working this range, paid for the knowledge directly, the way I nearly did, the way I still might, in whatever accounting a mountain that old keeps for the people who learn its rules the expensive way. I do not know how many handlers before me heard that same patient voice and did not walk back down the ladder. I do not know how many after me will hear it and forget, the way I nearly forgot, the specific cost that made the rule necessary in the first place. I have thought, often, about Odell Braxton, standing outside Corrigan Hut on that ordinary training day, delivering the rule to me without explanation, and I understand now what I could not understand then, that his silence was not evasion, but a kind of mercy. The same mercy I now extend to the handlers I train, a rule handed over intact, rather than diluted with a story that would only make it feel less urgent to a rookie who has not yet had a reason to believe it completely. I asked him once, years later, near the end of his own career, whether he had ever gone in against the rule himself. He looked at me for a long moment, the specific look of a man deciding how much of an old debt is still his to carry alone, and said only that he had, once, a long time before I knew him, and that he had been lucky, and that luck was not something either of us should ever plan around twice. I did not tell him about Doyle's rest that day, though I came closer than I ever had to telling anyone. Something in his answer, the specific weariness underneath it, made me understand that he already knew, in the way a person recognizes a debt in someone else's face, because they have carried the same shape of debt themselves, and that saying it aloud would have asked something of him I had no right to ask of a man that close to the end of his own career. We finished our coffee, talked instead about a training exercise scheduled for the following week, and I drove home that evening, carrying the same silence I have carried ever since, one debt quietly acknowledging another, without either of us needing to name it directly. I train new handlers now, mostly, having stepped back from active search rotations after that season for reasons I attribute publicly to my knees, which is true, and privately to something I have never fully explained to anyone on the team. Juno retired alongside me, officially for her age, though I suspect, watching how she still refuses to settle anywhere near the southern loop, on the rare occasions I drive that road, that her own reasons run parallel to mine. She sleeps most days now on a dog bed by my kitchen window, and I have noticed, more than once, that she lifts her head at nothing I can perceive, ears forward, holding that same full stillness for a few seconds before settling back down and I have stopped asking myself what she might be alerting to, because I am no longer certain I want the answer. I tell every new handler the same thing on their first season, the thing I was told, plainly once, the way you deliver a diagnosis rather than a story. If your dog alerts on a hut the registry shows as empty, you radio it in, you mark the coordinate, and you do not go inside. I do not tell them why. I have come to understand that this not telling is itself part of what I owe. The specific discipline of passing along a rule intact, rather than diluting it with an explanation. Nobody young enough to need the warning will actually believe until the night they are standing at a door with their own dog gone rigid against their leg, and a voice they recognize, calling patiently from somewhere just inside. What I owe, I think, is not an explanation at all. It is the rule itself, kept whole, handed forward exactly as bare, and exactly as absolute as it was handed to me, so that whatever I paid to learn it does not have to be paid again by someone standing where I once stood, weighing a mother's voice on the radio against 40 minutes and a closed door. Some nights, still, I dream about that hut, though the dream is never the loft itself, never the voice, only the ordinary approach up the trail toward Doyle's Rest in daylight. The hut sitting exactly as it always has. Stone walls, a wisp of smoke that should not be there, rising from a chimney the registry insists is cold, and I wake before I ever reach the door. My hand already halfway to the latch, and I lie there afterward, in the dark of my own bedroom, 200 miles from that ridge, listening to my own house settle, and I wonder, the way I imagine every handler who has ever broken that rule and lived to regret it must wonder whether the mountain considers a debt like mine ever fully paid, or whether it simply waits, patient as that voice was patient, for the next handler careless enough or wounded enough to answer a call it never actually made. 3 years ago, I could tell you the auction value of almost anything by looking at it for 4 seconds, and I could not tell you the last thing my father said to me on the phone. That is the kind of man the job made me, or maybe the kind of man it found. I worked the lien department at Sundown Self-Storage and Auction. 110 units of corrugated steel sitting off the old frontage road between Baker and the state line, where the interstate noise never quite reaches, and the heat sits on the asphalt like something waiting to be asked a question. My job on paper was simple. When a renter fell 3 months behind and stopped answering the certified letters, I opened the unit, inventoried the contents item by item for the county record, photographed everything, and flagged anything that looked like it might carry an estate claim, a will, a deed, a name that matched an obituary. Then the unit went to public auction, sold as, and I moved to the next one on the list. 40-50 units a month in the slow season. I was efficient. I was proud of being efficient. Efficiency was the thing I had, instead of feeling anything in particular. I took the job 8 months after my father died, in a house 40 minutes from mine that I had visited 4 times in the 2 years before that. He went quietly, alone, on a Tuesday, and a neighbor found him 3 days later because of the mail. I did not clean out his house. I paid a company to do it. The same kind of company I now worked adjacent to. And I told myself that was the responsible choice, the efficient choice. And I have believed a great many efficient things about myself since then that were not true. Walt Corva ran Sundown for 41 years before the county bought him out and kept the lien contracts running under new management, which is how I came to inherit not just his job, but his ledger. It was a green accounting book, the kind with marbled covers you do not see anymore, sitting in the bottom drawer of the office desk under a coffee tin full of dead pens. My supervisor, a heavy-set woman named Deb who had worked the front counter for 6 years and never once gone into a unit herself, told me Walt used to keep notes on the units nobody claimed. Sentimental? She said. Old guy, no family of his own, liked to remember people. She said it the way you say something you have decided not to think about further. And I did not think about it further either, not for a long while, because the ledger smelled faintly of orange rind and machine oil, and that smell was ordinary enough. Walt had apparently oiled the roll-up door tracks himself for 40 years, eating oranges while he worked, peeling them in one long, unbroken spiral, the way old men sometimes do to prove their hands still work. The smell was in the drawer and the tin and the pages. It smelled like an old man's habit. Nothing more. I want to be honest about how slowly it started, because the honest version does not make me look observant. And I have earned the right to stop pretending I noticed things sooner than I did. The first months were unremarkable. I opened units that held exactly what unpaid units hold. A marriage's furniture split down the middle. A business that failed and left its inventory to rot. A woman's whole wardrobe still on the hangers. Tags on some of it, waiting for an occasion that had stopped coming. I photographed, I logged, I flagged 3 units for possible estate claims, and heard nothing back on any of them. I learned the county's paperwork the way I had once learned spreadsheets at my old office job, because paperwork was a language that could not ask anything of me it did not already have a form for, and I liked that about it more than I would have admitted to anyone at the time, least of all myself. I ate lunch most days with Nessa, who ran the auction side, and had a laugh that came out sideways, like it surprised her every time. And some afternoons, the two of us sat in the shade behind the office with gas station sandwiches, and she told me about her kids. And I told her nothing about mine, because I did not have any, and for 20 minutes at a stretch, the desert did not feel like a place things went to be forgotten. It felt like a place you could just be a person in the sun with someone who liked you fine. I did not know yet how much I would need to remember that feeling later. Specifically, exactly, the paper wrapper crinkling in the heat, and Anessa laughing at something that was not even funny. There were small oddities in those early months, the kind you collect without noticing you are collecting them. The way dust collects on a fan blade you never look at directly. A unit that photographed one way on my phone and a slightly different way when I pulled the image up an hour later at the desk. A shadow near the back wall that had not been in the first frame, gone again as easily as a lens flare when I checked a third time. A tenant's name on an intake form that I could have sworn, an hour after typing it, had one letter more or less than it did now. Small enough every time to explain with tired eyes and bad fluorescent light, and a mind that had spent 2 years teaching itself not to look too closely at anything that might ask something of it. I filed each one under ordinary, the same drawer I had been filing things in since the week my father died, and I chose, instead of driving out to his house, to make 3 phone calls and hire it done. The ledger sat in the desk for 2 months before I opened it past the first page. When I did, I understood immediately what Deb had meant, and immediately that she had not told me the whole of it. Walt had not kept notes on units. He had kept notes on people. Each entry was a name, a unit number, a date, and then 2 or 3 lines in a small cramped hand that read less like an inventory and more like a confession made on someone else's behalf. Marguerite Oyelaren, Unit 62, 1991. Owed her sister 11 years of silence over a house that was never really about the house. Owed her son the truth about his father. Paid in the end with the ring, which I did not sell. I read 4 or 5 entries and closed the book, told myself it was a lonely old man's private hobby, filed it under sentimental the way Deb had, and went back to work. That was still the stretch of it, where I had a rational shelf to put things on, where every strange page could be set down next to an ordinary explanation and left there. The lingering detail arrived first as nothing at all. A smell of orange and oil in Unit 88, a unit that had been sealed since before I started. Its lock rusted enough that I had to cut it. Inside there were no oranges, no oil, nothing that could produce that smell. Just a dead man's furniture and 40 years of desert dust. I noted it, decided the smell must be carrying from the office, from my own hands, and moved on. It is easy, in hindsight, to see how much of my caution was really just my need to keep being the kind of person who finds an explanation and stops looking. The pattern that mattered started with Unit 41. The tenant, a man named Curtis Boyle, had been 3 months delinquent and unreachable, standard enough, except that when I cut the lock, the door came up smooth and silent on tracks that should have screamed with rust, the way every other track on that row screamed. A high, dry shriek you learn to brace for before you even set the bolt cutters down. Unit 41 made no sound at all. I remember standing there a full second longer than I needed to, just listening to the absence of that sound, before I told myself the track had been oiled recently, that Walt's habit had apparently outlived Walt. A maintenance man's ghost of routine and nothing more. Then the cold reached me before the door was even fully up. Not shaded concrete cold, the kind you get walking into any steel box out of the sun. Refrigerator cold in June, in a unit that had been sitting in Mojave heat since sunrise, with the sun already hard on its roof by 9 in the morning. I stood in the doorway, with the hair on my arms standing up, and told myself, the county's climate units sometimes ran their compressors long after tenants stopped paying for them. A bureaucratic oversight, nothing more. And I wrote that explanation down in my own head, like a receipt, before I had even checked whether Unit 41 had climate control, which it did not, which I confirmed on the intake sheet clipped to my board, while standing in air that fogged faintly in front of my mouth. That was the first snap, small enough that I still managed to file it as strange rather than wrong. The way you can still call a bruise a scratch if the color has not fully come in yet. Inside, along with a stripped motorcycle and 2 rows of unlabeled boxes, there was a spiral notebook, water damaged, and in it, in handwriting that was not Curtis Boyle's, 3 lines that had not been there the first time I flipped past them and were there the second. Curtis Boyle, Unit 41. Out his brother an apology he rehearsed 40 times and gave 0 times. Paid, this time, in the cold. I did not write that entry. I want to be extremely clear that I did not write that entry, And I have gone back over that afternoon more times than is good for me, trying to find the moment I might have, exhausted, absent-mindedly, picked up a pen that was not mine and made those words appear. And I cannot find it, because it never happened. The words were simply there the second time I looked, in Walt's hand, in a book Walt had been dead for 6 years to write in. I did what an efficient man does with a fact that cannot be efficient. I closed the notebook, finished the inventory, drove home, and slept 9 hours out of sheer refusal. 2 weeks later came the second cycle, and it did not let me refuse anything. Deb handed me a lean packet for Unit 14, with the kind of face people make when they are handing you something they already regret handing you. The name on the account was my father's. Not a namesake, not a coincidence of a common surname. His full name, his old address from before the house, 40 minutes away. An account opened the year after my parents' divorce. 31 years of storage rent auto-paid from an account that, according to the paperwork, had gone dormant the week he died and never been touched since. I had never known this unit existed. There is no reasonable way it should have existed under new management's records at all. The county contract began the year I took the job, and yet there it was, in the system, in my queue, waiting for me specifically, the way the whole facility seemed to have been waiting, patiently, the way a locked door waits. That was my cognitive retreat. Standing in the office, holding that packet, I counted the rivets in the drop ceiling tile above Deb's desk. 26 of them, and then I counted them again, because 26 was a number I could hold on to, and my father's handwriting on that account form was not. I told myself, driving out to Unit 14 with the cutters in the passenger seat, that this was a filing error, a duplicate record, some quirk of migrating decades of paper into a database, and that I would open the door and find someone else's abandoned furniture and laugh about it with Nessa at lunch. I want that sentence on the record, too, because it is the last time I managed to believe something convenient. The lock cut clean. The door came up on silent tracks. The unit was cold. Inside was my father's life, or the parts of it he had apparently paid, in cash for 31 years, to keep separate from the life I had known him to live. Boxes of a woman's clothing that was not my mother's. A crib disassembled, never used, the plastic still on the mattress. A shoebox of photographs of a child who was not me. At ages I recognized only because I had once been those ages myself in different photographs, in a different house. And on the workbench at the back, waiting, the way everything in that place waited. Another spiral notebook, and in it, in my father's own hand, an entry that had clearly been written across decades in different inks, added to a line at a time, the way a man adds to something he cannot finish in one sitting, because finishing it would mean admitting what it was. It did not have a deadline filled in. Every other entry I had seen, Walt's and the others, ended with a paid and a cost. My father's did not. It ended mid-sentence, the ink stopping the week he died on the words I always meant to tell. The cold in that unit was not the mild kind anymore. It went into my chest like a hand closing. And for the first time since I had started at sundown, my body did something it had not done in Unit 41 or Unit 88 or any of the small warnings before it. My ears rang, actually rang. A high thin note like a struck glass, held too close to a speaker, and my vision narrowed at the edges the way it does right before you faint. gray creeping in from both sides like a photograph developing in reverse, and my heartbeat filled my own skull the way it does after you have run somewhere too fast. I put my hand flat on the cold steel bench to keep from going down, and under my palm I felt, very distinctly, the workbench vibrate once. A low, patient thrum, like something enormous exhaling on the other side of a wall that should not have had another side. 31 years of a wall. A wall built out of every month. My father had auto-paid a bill for a life he never once mentioned. I made myself keep breathing through my mouth, counting, the way you count rivets in a ceiling tile, when a number is the only clean thing left to hold. And I got to 11 before the smell arrived. Orange rind and machine oil, so strong it was almost a taste, filling a sealed steel box that had no oranges in it, and no reason to smell like my father's garage on a Sunday afternoon 20 years gone. And that was the moment I understood, with my whole body before my mind caught up, that whatever this place was, it did not only keep the dead's unfinished business. It kept mine too, apparently, and had been keeping it a long time before I ever cut a single lock. It turned its head. That was all. I stopped breathing. I do not know how else to describe what happened next, except to say that the shape of the thing was less important than what it did, which was simple. Somewhere in the boxes behind me, without my touching anything, a photograph slid off its stack and landed face up on the concrete. And it was a photograph of me at 9 years old at my father's old address, on a day I do not remember being photographed, and across the white border beneath it, in the same failing hand as the ledger, 3 words had been written that had not been written when the photograph was taken. Still waiting, Daniel. My name is Daniel. I had never told Walt Corva my name. Walt Corva had been dead for 6 years. I got out of that unit the way you get out of deep water, when you have gone under wrong. Not gracefully, scraping my forearm on the door track hard enough to bleed. A thin red line I did not notice until I was back in the truck with the engine running and the air conditioning doing nothing against a cold that had come from inside me and not the desert at all. I did not go back for 4 days. In those 4 days I called in sick twice, told Deb it was my stomach, and did not sleep more than 3 hours a night in any of them, lying in the dark running the math of it over and over. 31 years of payments, a dormant account, a photograph with my own childhood face and a message that had not existed when the photograph was taken, trying to find the version of that math that came out ordinary and never once finding it. I could not make myself say any of it out loud to anyone, not Nessa, not Deb, because saying it out loud felt like it would make me the kind of man who wrote in ledgers instead of the kind of man who filed reports. And I had built my whole adult self since the week the neighbor found my father because of the mail, on being the second kind. Nessa texted me on the 3rd day, just a photo of a bag of oranges from the gas station with the words "got extras. Come back and eat something," and I sat on my kitchen floor, holding my phone, and cried in a way I had not managed to do at my father's funeral, where I had stood dry-eyed and useful, helping the funeral director with the folding chairs, because helping with chairs was a task with a clear beginning and end, and grief, as far as I understood it then, was not. On the 5th day I understood. Finally, slowly. The way you understand a bruise is going to be worse. Before you have even looked at it, what the ledger actually was, and what it had always been. Walt had not haunted anyone. Walt had made himself into a keeper, A man who witnessed what the dead had left unfinished because someone had to, and the county forms did not have a line for it. And in exchange, or in cost, or in whatever logic runs underneath a thing like that, the keeping had passed to whoever finished reading. Not the units, the debts, the unpaid word, the unmade call, the truth that sat in a drawer for 31 years instead of a mouth. Something in that place had learned, across 4 decades of a lonely man tending it, that unfinished things want to be finished, and that the person standing closest, holding the pen, inventorying the evidence, was as good a hand as any to finish them with. My father's entry was still open, because my father had died before he could pay it, and it had waited, patiently, the way the whole lot waited, for someone with his blood and his handwriting habits and his last name to walk into Unit 14 and pick up where he had stopped. I went back on the 6th day in daylight, with Nessa's coffee thermos in the truck, because she had shoved it at me that morning saying I looked like hell and needed to eat something, and that ordinary, unasked-for kindness was the last small, warm thing I let myself feel before I did what I went there to do. I did not try to sell the unit's contents. I did not photograph the crib or the shoebox for the county file. I sat down on an overturned bucket in the cold, with my father's ledger open on my knees, and I picked up a pen, and I finished his sentence myself, because he could not. Because dying does not finish anything. It just stops the pen. I wrote, I always meant to tell my son that I loved the other family too, in a different way, badly, wrongly, and that I never found the courage to let both halves of my life know each other, and that the silence I kept for 31 years cost him a father who could have been whole, instead of one who was only ever half present, distracted, keeping count of a debt he never once mentioned. I am sorry it took his death, and mine, and a room full of cold, for either of us to say it. I do not know if that counted in whatever accounting the place kept. I know the cold let go of my chest the moment I set the pen down all at once, the way a held breath finally leaves a room. I know the ringing in my ears stopped. I know that when I stood up, the crib and the shoebox and the woman's clothing were still there. Ordinary, sad, unremarkable objects again, no longer waiting for anything. Just left behind the way things are left behind by people who ran out of time. I finished the rest of that day's route like any other, because there was no form for what had happened, and I did not know, yet, what else a man like me was supposed to do with an afternoon once he had done the one true thing in it. I sold nothing out of Unit 14. I told Deb the county estate claim flag was going on it permanently, which was not exactly a lie, and I drove home and slept 9 hours straight for the first time since my father died. A black, dreamless sleep, I woke from feeling lighter in my chest than I had in 2 years, the way you feel after finally putting down something you had carried so long you forgot it had weight. I quit 2 months later. I told Deb it was for a better paying job, which was efficient and untrue in equal measure, and she did not ask further, and Nessa hugged me in the parking lot hard enough that I felt it in my ribs, and told me to eat more sandwiches wherever I went next, and I have not been back to that stretch of frontage road since. I still think about the 109 other units I never opened, whether any of them are quietly holding a debt of someone else's that is still patiently waiting for the right hand to come along and finish it. I hope, if that is true, that whoever holds Walt's pen next reads slower than I did, and asks more questions of what they find than I let myself ask for the first 4 months. I still know exactly what orange rind and machine oil smell like on a hot afternoon, and I know now that it was never Walt's smell at all, not really, though I imagine he came by it the same way I did. An old man peeling oranges to keep his hands busy while he did something he could not otherwise bear to sit still for. It was my father's smell first. He kept a pocket knife in his garage for peeling oranges in one long, unbroken spiral, the way old men do to prove their hands still work, and I had forgotten that completely. Had let 2 years and a funeral and a hired cleaning crew erase it clean out of me, until a locked steel box in the middle of the Mojave Desert, built by a stranger, kept by a curse, made me remember it whether I wanted to or not. I do not know what happens to sundown self-storage now that I am gone. Whether the ledger is still in that drawer under the coffee tin of dead pens, whether it is only ever handed to men like me, men who are good at inventorying other people's lives because it lets them avoid the audit of their own. I hope, if it is, that whoever holds the pen next finishes their debt faster than I finished mine. I did not owe money to that place. I owed a sentence to my father, and I paid it 31 years and one drawer cold afternoon too late. And that is the part of the story I actually tell. When I tell it at all, not the cold, not the photograph, not the thing that turned its head. The part where I finally wrote down, in my own hand, what I always meant to say, and understood, far too late to matter to him, that the mail is what finds you in the end, when you have let too much of your life go unsaid. I have been a search and rescue dog handler for 11 years, and in that time I have learned that the mountain never actually stops you out there. It only ever offers you a choice at the exact moment you are too tired to choose well, and then it lets you live with whichever way you go. I want to tell you that plainly before anything else, because everything that happened at the Whitcomb huts happened to a man who thought he already understood that lesson, and had not, in fact, learned it at all. My name is Wes Calder. My dog's name was Juniper, a 9-year-old Belgian Malinois with a nose I would have trusted over my own eyes, and I want to say her name now, early, because by the end of this, I am not sure I get to say it the way I mean to. 3 years ago, in a whiteout on the same range I am about to describe, I called off a search for a woman named Dana Ashworth, my search partner of 6 years, my closest friend, and by most accounts the better handler of the two of us. I called it off because the avalanche risk had gone from considerable to unacceptable in the space of 40 minutes, because protocol said the risk to searchers cannot exceed the plausible survivability of the missing person, and because I was the ranking handler on scene and the decision, correctly, was mine to make. I have run that 40 minutes back through my head perhaps 11,000 times since. Dana's body was recovered the following spring, 600 yards from where we turned back. I do not tell you this to earn your sympathy. I tell you because you need to understand what kind of man walked back into the Whitcomb Range this past October, and why he was exactly the wrong person and exactly the right one for what the mountain had waiting for him. I had not taken a call in that range since. 3 years of easier terrain, day hikes, and car-accessible trailheads. The kind of work where the worst outcome is a broken ankle and a long carry. I told myself this distance had healed something. It had only ever been geography. The call came in on a Tuesday, relayed through the county sheriff's office, and then the regional SAR coordinator. The way these things always come, flat and procedural until you're standing in the actual cold. A 24-year-old day hiker named Elias Farrow had gone up toward the Whitcomb Hut Circuit. 4 stone shelters built in the 1930s, strung along a loop trail above 11,000 feet, originally for sheep herders moving stock between summer pastures, and later handed over to the Forest Service for emergency shelter use, and had not come back down before an early storm sealed the range for 2 days. When the weather broke, his truck was still at the trailhead, a light dusting of new snow undisturbed on the windshield, no footprints leading away from it that hadn't already been half erased by wind. I brought Juniper. I told myself I brought her because she was the best dog in 3 counties for altitude scent work, which was true, and I did not let myself examine the other reason, which was that some part of me still believed if I went back up there enough time, I might eventually bring somebody home, instead of finding what was left of them. The ranger cabin at the trailhead smelled of wood smoke and diesel, and the particular mildew of a building that spends most of the year empty, and the volunteers gathered. They were strange with me in a way I noticed, and then set aside. The way you set aside anything you don't have room to carry yet. An older man named Hollis Pruitt, 70 at least, weathered the specific brown red of a lifetime at altitude, poured me coffee from a dented percolator, and told me, almost gently, not to push too hard the first few days. They always come back, he said, not looking at me directly, on the 7th. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said it the way you'd explain a local custom to a tourist, patient and a little amused at my not already knowing, and told me it was just something people said in this range, had said for generations, going back to before the huts were even huts, back to when it was only shepherds and the animals they lost. I filed it under superstition, the kind every isolated community grows for itself to make an indifferent mountain feel governed by something, and got Juniper into her harness. The first 2 days of the search were ordinary in the worst way, cold, methodical, unproductive. We worked the lower loop in 8-hour shifts, breaking for the brutal early dark that comes at that elevation in October, and Juniper covered better than 11 miles of switchback and scree without so much as a hesitation in her gait, and found nothing. No scent cone drifting downslope on the wind, no dropped glove, no energy bar wrapper, no boot print holding its edge in old snow. It was as though Elias Farrow had gone up the trailhead and simply stopped existing partway up the mountain, which is a thought I have had about missing people before, and have learned to distrust, because it is usually only exhaustion talking. The radio chatter those first 2 days had the particular rhythm I've come to know from 100 searches like it, clipped call signs and grid references, base to Team 2, Team 2 copies, negative contact, continuing to grid Charlie, over. A rhythm that becomes its own kind of comfort after a while. Proof that other people are out there doing the same patient, unglamorous work you are, sweeping the same indifferent slopes. I found myself listening to it more than I needed to on the second night, turning the volume up on Channel 2 long after my own shift had ended, the way you'd leave a television on for company in an empty house. On the 3rd day we reached the first hut, A squat stone box with a single shuttered window and a chain-locked logbook bolted inside the doorframe, its last entry dated in August. Juniper's whole body changed 40 feet out, ears forward, tail low and rigid along the spine. Weight shifted onto her front legs the way I trained into her from 12 weeks old, and she held that posture pointed directly at the hut's door, which had not, according to the log, been opened by anyone in 2 months. I told myself it was residual scent. Huts like this collect the smell of every hiker who has passed through in 80 years, layered into the stone and the floorboards, and the old wool blankets stacked on the bunk shelf, and a dog as good as Juniper can sometimes alert on scent history rather than a live trail, especially at altitude, where thin air and constant wind do strange, unpredictable things to particulate drift. I wrote it in my log as a probable historical alert. Photograph the undisturbed snow at the threshold for the record, and moved us on toward the second hut. I want to be honest that I believed my own explanation completely in the moment. The way you believe anything convenient when the alternative is standing alone at 11,000 feet with a dog telling you, with everything her body knows how to say, that a locked, empty building is neither locked nor empty. That night, back at the base camp we'd set up a half-mile below treeline, Hollis brought me coffee I hadn't asked for and sat across the fire without saying much for a long while, the kind of silence that isn't empty so much as loaded, waiting for permission. Eventually he told me that every family in the valley keeps something at each hut. An old glove, a photograph, a child's shoe, something belonging to someone once missing from that family, left there quietly, generation after generation, so that the mountain, in his words, knows who it's holding and who it still owes. I laughed not unkindly and asked him if he actually believed that, expecting the sheepish half-smile people give you. When they repeat a superstition, they don't quite hold themselves. He didn't smile. He looked at me a long moment across the fire and said his own grandfather had gone missing in this exact range in 1961, during a storm not unlike the one that had just passed, and had walked out of the third hut on the 7th day afterward, healthy, calm, unmarked by frostbite, despite 2 nights well below zero. And Hollis said this part slowly, watching my face, while he said it, 5 years younger in the face than the photograph taken of him the week before he vanished. His grandfather never spoke of where he had been for the rest of his life. Not once, not even at the end of it. Hollis told me this, the way you'd report a fact you had simply decided, a long time ago, to stop being frightened of. Because being frightened of it for 60 years hadn't changed a single thing about whether it was true. I did not sleep well that night, though I told myself it was only the altitude, and the coffee, and the particular restlessness of the first days of any hard search, when your body has not yet learned to rest inside the fear the way it will by the end. On the 4th day, at the second hut, Juniper found fresh boot prints in 3 inches of new snow, circling the structure twice before stopping, dead center, at the locked door. Elias Farrow's boot size, cross-referenced against the tread pattern his mother had described from his hiking boots at home, matched to the half size. There was no trail leading to those prints from any direction, and no trail leading away from them. They simply existed, a closed loop pressed into snow that had fallen only that morning, wrapped twice around a door that had not, by any measure I could find, been opened. I stood there a long time in the cold, running the numbers the way I always do when I don't want to feel something. Elevation, wind chill, estimated hours since the snowfall based on crystal structure, distance remaining to the third hut, hours of usable daylight left in the shortening October afternoon, reciting them to myself under my breath the way another man might recite a prayer, because a number is a fact, and a fact was the only thing I had left that could not also be something else. My hands had gone stiff inside my gloves 2 full days before their time. That is a small thing, and I want you to hold on to it as small, because everything that followed built itself out of things exactly that size. A stiffness, a sound, a smell, nothing large enough on its own to justify the fear it was quietly compounding into. On the 5th day, I called my sister from the one spot on the ridge where a signal sometimes catches, mostly because I needed, badly, to hear an ordinary voice say ordinary things. She put her son on the phone, 4 years old, halfway through an elaborate and entirely invented story about a dinosaur who ran a bakery and refused, on principle, to sell croissants to other dinosaurs on the grounds. He explained with great seriousness that croissants were a French dinosaur secret and could not be shared with dinosaurs from other countries. For 6 full minutes I stood in the wind with frost forming along my collar and laughed, actually laughed, out loud alone on a ridge, at a 4-year-old's dinosaur baker and his geopolitics of pastry. And when the call finally dropped, I found that my hands had stopped shaking without my having noticed they'd started again. I held on to that 6 minutes longer than I let on to anyone at camp that night, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone worn smooth, because it was the only thing all week that had asked nothing of me. That same evening, sitting apart from the fire, with my logbook open and unwritten in my lap, I caught myself doing something I have done on every hard search since I first trained as a handler, though I had never before noticed myself doing it in quite so deliberate a way. I began reciting our search protocol out loud under my breath, low enough that no one else at camp would hear. Sector boundaries, minimum team spacing on steep terrain, the 6 criteria for suspending a live find operation, the exact wording of the radio call that converts a search from rescue to recovery, the whole dry architecture of the job, laid out like a ladder I could climb hand over hand instead of looking down. I told myself it was just review, the kind any careful handler runs before a critical day. I do not think, looking back, that it was review at all. I think it was the only place left in my head that still felt like solid ground, and I went there the way you'd go to stand on a floor you trusted, because I could not yet afford to think about the double knock, or the boot prints in a closed loop, or what it might mean that my dog would not stop watching a shut door. That was the last easy night. On the 6th day, at the third hut, the same one Hollis's grandfather had walked out of in 1961, Juniper alerted the moment we came within sight of it, harder than I had ever seen her alert on a live subject in 11 years of working with her. And when we reached the door, unlocked this time, swinging slightly on a hinge gone loose with age, we found Elias Farrow's pack sitting just inside on the dirt floor, dry, undamaged, food and water bottles still in it, everything folded and arranged with a neatness no exhausted. Hypothermic hiker produces on his own after 5 days exposed. Beside it, on the single warped wooden shelf above the cold hearth, sat an old brass compass I did not recognize, its glass fogged with age, and a child's mitten, red wool, decades worn thin at the thumb, that I understood, without being told anything further, belonged to someone's family debt, long since owed and not yet paid. I want to describe what happened next the way it actually happened, without making it larger than it was, because the smallness of it is the entire horror. I crouched to photograph the pack for the search log, my knees aching from 6 days of altitude and cold, and behind me, from a hut I had already searched and marked cleared 4 days prior, less than 200 yards back down the loop, I heard once very clearly, carried on a lull in the wind, the specific double knock Dana Ashworth used to give on a cabin door before opening it. 2 quick raps, a pause exactly as long as a held breath, then a third, a habit of hers so particular, so entirely her own, that I had never once heard anyone else do it in 11 years of this work, before or since. I stopped breathing. I did not turn around right away. I want you to understand that. I stayed crouched over that pack for what felt like a very long time, my camera still raised, because turning around meant finding out whether I had imagined it. And not turning around let both possibilities stay true a little longer. And there is a particular kind of cowardice in that stillness that I have not fully forgiven myself for yet. When I did turn, the hut behind me stood exactly as it had. Door shut, snow undisturbed on its threshold. Nothing moving anywhere on the whole white slope between us. Juniper was staring at it anyway, ears forward, utterly still. She did not bark, did not whine, did not do any of the things a working dog does when it wants you to follow it towards something. She only watched that closed door the way you watch a held breath, waiting to see whether it gets let out. The ringing in my ears started that afternoon and did not fully leave for 2 days. A high, thin whine I could quiet only by stepping into open wind. My vision narrowed at the edges whenever I stood too quickly from a crouch. A tunneling I recognized from nowhere good. The kind you're taught to watch for in early hypothermia and altitude sickness, both, except my core temperature that evening, read within a normal range on the thermometer clipped to my pack, which told me nothing except that, whatever this was, it was declining to explain itself in numbers I knew how to argue with. My chest felt tight in a way no elevation should account for in a man of my conditioning, and I began, without quite deciding to, avoiding my own reflection in the small signal mirror I carry, clipped to my vest strap, because each time I caught it by accident, I found myself checking my own face. For 5 years I had not yet lost, the way Hollis's grandfather had lost them, silently somewhere on this exact mountain 63 years before. On the 7th morning, Hollis found me before I found him. Walked into camp at first light, with his breath fogging thick in the cold, and said only, "Today, the way you'd announce weather rather than a fact about a missing man." I asked him how anyone could be certain of that. He told me the range had never once been wrong about the day. Not in the 100 and some years anyone in the valley had kept count, only about who came back and in what condition. And that the second part, he said carefully, watching me while he said it, seemed to depend on what the searchers themselves were willing to leave behind up there while they looked. I understood him more than I wanted to. I did not ask him to say more. Some part of me already knew that asking would only make the answer arrive sooner. We found Elias Farrow walking down the loop trail from the 4th hut at 11 that morning, upright, unharmed, 7 days unfed and unshielded, through 2 nights well below zero, without frostbite on a single finger. without so much as a cracked lip, wearing an expression I can only describe as the specific calm of a man who has been very carefully emptied of something and has not yet noticed the shape of the space where it used to sit. He was wearing the same light jacket he'd set out in a week earlier, according to his mother's description, unstained, unfrayed, smelling faintly. When I got close enough to help him sit, of cold stone and something else beneath it, I could not place at first, and then did. The same fogged glass, old metal smell that had come off the brass compass on the shelf in the third hut. The smell of a thing that has sat still in the dark for a very long time. He knew his own name without hesitation. He did not know, when I asked him gently, checking his orientation the way protocol requires, what year it currently was, and guessed wrong by 3, and did not seem troubled by the correction the way a frightened, freshly rescued person should be troubled by discovering a gap like that in himself. He asked, politely, almost as an afterthought, whether his dog was all right, and when I told him I didn't know he had a dog, he frowned, briefly. The way you frown at a word in your own language that has suddenly stopped making sense, and then let it go, and never mentioned it again for the rest of the day. Nobody at the trailhead corrected him either, and I understood, watching his mother's face carefully, that Elias Farrow had never owned a dog in his life. He thanked me. He shook my hand. His hand was warm, entirely warm, which at that altitude, after 7 days, with no shelter beyond stone walls and no fire, should not have been possible by any measure of human physiology I have ever been trained in. And I held on to that handshake, half a second longer than courtesy required, trying to feel whether anything at all was missing from it, some coldness or hesitation that would tell me what I already suspected, and I could not tell you, even now, whether I felt something in that half-second or only wanted to badly enough to invent it. That was the moment I understood what Hollis had actually been telling me, in his slow, unhurried way, for 6 days. The range did not lose people and then decide, out of some late mercy, to give them back whole. It borrowed them. The way you'd borrow against a debt, already carried by their family, by their valley, by whoever left a mitten or a compass or a photograph at the right hut, at the right time across 100 years of unspoken arrangement, and it repaid the loan precisely on schedule, every 7th day, but never in the same coin it had taken. What came back down that trail was Elias Farrow's face, Elias Farrow's name, most of Elias Farrow's memory, and something else besides, some small unaccountable margin of him, paid quietly to whatever kept the ledger, so the exchange could close clean, and no one at the trailhead would ever think to ask what the transaction had actually cost. The false rescue was not that no one came back. It was that someone always did, healthy and grateful and utterly convincing, warm-handed and clear-eyed and thankful in exactly the way relief is supposed to look, and that the thing missing from them was small enough and slow enough for the people who loved him to notice. That everyone standing at that trailhead called it a miracle and went home relieved, the way I very nearly did myself, standing right there among them. I did not call it a miracle. I stood at that trailhead with Juniper, leaning her full weight against my leg, the way she does only when something is deeply, unmistakably wrong, and I thought about Dana, 600 yards from where we turned back, never given her 7 days at all because I had made a decision protocol told me was correct at the time and tells me still, to this day, was correct, and I understood finally, plainly, standing in that gravel lot in the thin October sun, that the debt I actually owed was not to this range, and no hut strung along it, and no mitten left waiting on any shelf, could ever be made to settle on my behalf. I had not lost Dana to the mountain. I had lost her to my own good judgment, exercised at exactly the moment it should have failed me and didn't. And no seventh day was ever coming for that particular account, because I was the one who closed it myself 40 minutes too early, 3 years before I ever walked back up here believing, foolishly, that I had come this time to save somebody else instead. I drove Elias Farrow down to the trailhead that afternoon and watched his mother run to him across the gravel. Watched her hands find his face, his shoulders, his hair, checking him the instinctive way a parent checks a child for damage, finding none. And I watched him hug her back with warm, unfrostbitten hands. And I felt Juniper's weight shift against my leg one more time, harder, and I understood that whatever the range had taken from him to make that particular reunion possible was already gone, uncounted and unrecoverable, filed somewhere I would never see the ledger for, and that no one standing in that parking lot weeping with relief would ever be told the actual price of what they were looking at. I did not tell them either. Some debts are not mine to collect, and some rescues are not mine to correct. Even when I am the only one who came down off that mountain understanding exactly what they had cost, and even when the cheaper one, the one that would have let me sleep, was simply to believe, the way everyone else in that parking lot believed, that the mountain had simply been kind. I used to believe the worst thing a registrar could do was let a bad object into a good collection. I do not believe that anymore. I have since learned that the worst thing, the thing that will actually cost you something, is letting a good person walk into a bad collection, 'cause stopping her would have cost you your job. I want to explain how I came to know that, because the knowing did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most true things in my profession arrive, item by item, gift by gift, each one small enough on its own to accept without flinching. I had been a registrar for 11 years before I came to Aldrich County, cataloging and conserving other people's histories at a mid-sized city museum where I was, by most measures, good at my job. Good enough that when a private collector named Whitcomb offered our Asian art wing a donation of 41 pieces, provenance paperwork thinner than I liked, but not thin enough to refuse outright, I flagged the gaps in an internal memo. And then, when my director made clear how much the capital campaign needed that donation announced before the gala, I let the flag stay internal. I was on medical leave when the accession was finalized, and the condition reports went out under the co-signing signature of my assistant registrar, a careful, exacting young woman named Priya Anand, at my own written instruction, because I trusted her judgment as much as my own. 8 months later, federal investigators traced 11 of those pieces to a temple complex outside Siem Reap. The story that ran in 3 papers did not use my name. It used Priya's, because Priya's signature was the one on the file, and I did not correct the record because correcting it would have meant admitting what I had known and chosen not to say. She lost her accreditation. I do not know what she is doing now. I have looked twice and closed the search both times before I let myself find out. My director called me into her office the week the 3rd article ran. not to fire me, since nothing in my own file connected me to the memo I had written and never escalated, but to tell me, gently, in the careful language institutions use when they mean the opposite of what they say, that a fresh start might serve everyone. I understood her. I had used that same language myself twice, with junior staff whose only real failure had been trusting a system that did not deserve it. I packed my office in a single afternoon, 4 boxes and a desk plant I gave to the security guard. And I did not tell a single colleague where I was going, because I had not yet decided whether I deserved to be found. I took the Aldrich County job the following spring because it was quiet, because it was 3 states away, and because a county historical society housed in a converted 1904 bank building did not sound like the kind of place where a person's carelessness could cost anyone very much. I want you to sit with how wrong I was about that, because I sat with it for the better part of a year before I understood. The building still had its vault. The county had converted it decades ago into climate-controlled storage, the original steel door left standing open on its hinges as a kind of civic decoration. 4 inches of case-hardened steel that the placard in the lobby described, with evident local pride as strong enough to survive a direct hit. The vault itself was small by modern archival standards, perhaps 400 square feet, lined floor to ceiling with the kind of steel shelving units that never quite lose their bank smell, cold metal and old varnish, and something mineral underneath that I never fully identified. A single narrow window near the ceiling let in a bar of light each afternoon that crossed the room in about 40 minutes and was gone. I worked inside that vault most days, among the acid-free boxes and the humidity gauges, and for the first several months I found the work exactly as restful as I had hoped. The collection told the story of one family, the Aldrichs, who had founded the town, financed its bank, its rail spur, its first newspaper, and who had, over 5 generations, funded most of what the Historical Society now existed to preserve. The last Aldrich, a reclusive woman named Corinne, communicated with the Society only through her attorney, and had done, as far as anyone could tell me, for the better part of 2 decades. I asked, in my first month, whether anyone had actually met her. Nobody had. The board president told me, half joking, that Corinne Aldrich was less a person to him now than a line item, a reliable annual gift that arrived every December like weather. The gifts began in my 3rd month, arriving through that same attorney at a pace of 1 every 3 or 4 weeks, always accompanied by a brief formal letter and a modest but real appraisal value. A pocket watch belonging to the county's first postmaster, a woman's mourning brooch, jet and gold, containing a lock of hair behind a clouded oval of glass, a tin rent collection box, dented along one seam, the kind estate agents once carried door to door on quarter days. Each one, on its own, was an ordinary and welcome addition to a small county collection that had never had much money to build itself properly. I logged them, assessed them, wrote my thank you letters, and did not think much more about any single one of them. What I began to notice, sometime in my 5th month, was not any single gift, but the pattern the gifts made together. I kept, as most registrars do, a private want list, an unpublished working document where I noted the specific holes in our holdings, the kinds of objects that would round out an exhibit or answer a donor's question, updated as I worked and shared with no one, but occasionally referenced in a grant narrative in the vaguest possible terms. The objects arriving from the Aldrich Trust matched that list with a precision that had no business existing. I had written, in that private document and nowhere else, a note wishing for a mourning piece to anchor our Victorian domestic life case. 9 days later, the brooch arrived. I told myself, the first time, that it was coincidence, the kind any working registrar learns to expect in a town small enough that everyone's grandmother kept the same 3 kinds of jewelry. I told myself that the second time, too, when a christening gown appeared 11 days after I had noted, only in that private file, a gap in our infant mortality display. I stopped being able to tell myself that the third time, when the rent tin arrived 4 days after I had written, in language I had used nowhere else, in a document that lived only on a password-protected laptop in a locked office, that our economic history case needed something to represent the tenant side of the county's land disputes. I sat with the tin box in my lap for a long time that afternoon, in the vault, with the door propped on its ancient hinge, and the humidity gauge ticking its small mechanical breath beside me, and felt the particular cold of a fact I did not want to be a fact. I checked the laptop twice for signs of intrusion, ran the security logs myself the way I would for any donor institution reporting a possible breach, and found nothing, no remote access, no shared drive, no browser history that explained it. I called the attorney's office the next morning, under the pretext of confirming the tin box's provenance file, and asked, as casually as I could manage, how Miss Aldrich decided what to send and when. The attorney, a courteous older man named Fenwick, who had clearly fielded stranger questions from stranger registrars, told me only that Miss Aldrich took a close personal interest in the society's needs, and left it at that, in a tone that closed the subject as gently and completely as the vault door itself. I told myself, because the alternative was a thought I did not have room for yet, that Corinne Aldrich's attorney must simply have access to the grant reports I filed publicly each quarter, vague as those reports were, and that a careful reader could infer more than I meant to reveal. I wrote wind shadow in my head, though it was not the right words for this profession, and I felt the specific relief of an explanation landing, even though some part of me had already stopped believing it. My intern that year was a 20-year-old named Mara Doss, community college, local, the kind of quick and careful hire a county historical society is lucky to get and rarely keeps. Her family had farmed Aldrich land as tenants for 3 generations before losing the lease in 1931 over a debt dispute. Nobody in her family had ever seen documented, only heard about, passed down as a story with the hard edges worn soft by retelling. She had grown up 4 miles from the building we worked in and had never once, she told me, been inside it as a child, because her grandmother would not cross the threshold of anything built by an Aldrich, a rule Mara had broken the day she applied for the internship and never quite explained to her grandmother afterward. She loved the work in the unguarded way people love things before disappointment teaches them caution. And some evenings after close we sat together in the vault with tea from a chipped pot she kept in the break room, going through unprocessed boxes while she asked me questions about accession numbers and deed research. And I remember thinking, more than once, that this was the first work in a long time that had felt entirely uncomplicated. I had not told her about Priya. I had not told anyone at Aldrich County about Priya. I told myself that was privacy. I understand now it was rehearsal for the same silence I was about to choose again. The gifts kept coming through the winter, and I kept cataloging them. And I kept not saying to my director or to Mara or to anyone that a private document on a locked laptop seemed to be predicting them. I told myself I was documenting the way I document everything methodically, because documenting was the only language my discomfort and I had ever agreed on. What I did not tell myself, not yet, was the real reason I kept accepting each new piece without raising the pattern. The collection was, quarter over quarter, becoming remarkable, and a remarkable small county collection meant grant attention, and grant attention meant a director who trusted me. And a director who trusted me meant I would never again be the registrar whose silence cost someone else her name. I was rebuilding my reputation one perfectly matched gift at a time, and I did not let myself look too closely at what that rebuilding was made of. The sensory trouble started around the same time, small enough at first that I filed it under fatigue. Holding the christening gown to photograph it for the catalog, I felt for perhaps 2 seconds a cold closing over my own chest like water, sudden and specific, gone before I could name it. Cataloging the pocket watch, I caught, faint and wrong, the smell of coal smoke and wet wool in a room with no fireplace and no wool in it. Measuring the brooch clasp under the loop, my own pulse seemed to slow to match something that was not my heartbeat. A heavier, older rhythm I felt in my jaw before I felt it anywhere else. And I set the loop down and gripped the edge of the work table until my own pulse came back to me, and not before. I wrote these off, one at a time, as the ordinary strain of close object handling in a poorly ventilated vault. A rational and professional explanation, and for a while that explanation held, the way a fence holds back a fire that has not yet decided to test it. It was only later, cataloging the whole run of incidents in order the way I catalog everything, that I noticed each one had grown longer than the last 2 seconds becoming 5. 5 becoming what felt, with the tin box, like nearly 20, my body keeping a tally my mind had refused to make. We had one good evening that winter, that I still think about more than any other, a Thursday in February when a storm kept the roads bad enough that Mara stayed past closing, rather than drive the ridge road in the dark. We sat in the vault with the space heater ticking, and the tea gone lukewarm in its chipped pot. And she told me the story of her great-great-grandmother's eviction the way her family told it, half legend, half grievance. And I told her, in return, an easier story about my own grandmother's kitchen. And for 2 hours neither of us mentioned the collection at all. It was warm in a way the rest of that year was not. Small and specific and entirely unstaged. And when she finally drove home, I stood in the empty vault a moment longer than I needed to, grateful for something I could not yet name and did not deserve to keep. The Society's board announced the gala in March, a 100th anniversary exhibition to be called the Aldrich Century, complete, timed to the founding family's centennial and funded, in no small part, by the promise of a final significant Aldrich donation to close out the collection. My director asked me, in a meeting I remember for how easily I said yes, to prepare a public gap analysis for the donor's attorney. An actual formal document this time, listing precisely what the exhibit still needed to feel finished. I wrote it in an afternoon. I told myself this was simply good museum. Practice, transparent and professional, the kind of document any accredited institution produces routinely. I did not let myself sit with how closely it resembled handing someone a shopping list for whatever it was that had already been reading my private one. 2 weeks before the gala, Mara came to me holding the rent tin, turning it over in her hands the way you turn over something you are trying not to believe. She had been researching her own family for a class project, and had found in a country records microfilm her great-great-grandmother's name on a 1931 eviction notice and a description of a dented tin box, quarter-day rents that had been confiscated as part of the settlement and never returned, not donated. Confiscated 100 years ago by the family whose descendants' attorney had mailed it to me 9 days after I wished for it in a document no one else should have been able to read. She looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself once, in a director's office, deciding whether a flag was worth raising. She asked me what I thought it meant that everything in the collection that had arrived that year seemed to have a story exactly like this one behind it, taken, not given, and passed off as generosity 100 years later. I told her I would look into it. I did not look into it. I told myself there would be time after the gala. The days before the opening ran together the way the worst days of a project always do. Condition reports and loan agreements, and a caterer who needed the vault's exact humidity range in writing, and somewhere in the middle of that blur, Mara told me she wanted to contribute something of her own to the exhibit. A hand-stitched sampler her family had kept through 5 generations. The one object from the eviction her great-great-grandmother had managed to hide in her apron before the wagon left. She wanted it displayed beside the tin box, she said, so the exhibit would tell both halves of the story instead of only the Aldrich's half. It was, professionally, an excellent idea, the kind of curatorial correction that wins grants and quiets critics. And I told her yes before I had let myself finish the thought that had risen, cold and small, the moment she set the sampler down on my desk, that the collection, which had spent a year matching every private wish I had never spoken aloud, now had, sitting on my desk 2 weeks before its own completion, the one object it had never once been sent. The one thing about the Doss family it did not already own, offered freely, by the one person in the building who trusted me enough to hand it over without asking what I would do with it. I felt the cold water again that night, longer this time, not 2 seconds but nearly a full minute, sitting in my own kitchen with the sampler's accession worksheet still open on the laptop in front of me, and somewhere underneath it, I caught myself thinking, absurdly, about a grant report 3 weeks overdue to the State Humanities Council, a small administrative fact with no business occupying space in a mind that should have been entirely occupied by fear. I sat with that thought a long time, the report, the deadline, the formatting the council preferred for object counts, and I understood, distantly, that I was doing what I had always done at the worst moments of my career, reaching for the smallest available task instead of the largest available truth. I did not stop the exhibit. I told myself, standing in the vault 2 days before the gala, with the sampler cataloged and shelved beside the tin box, that raising the pattern now, days before opening, days before the board's largest fundraising night in a decade, would look exactly like the kind of unfounded panic that had once cost Priya her career for a decision that was mine. I told myself Mara had offered the sampler freely, that freely given was not the same as taken, that I was protecting her family's story by giving it a place beside the Aldrichs, instead of erasing it the way the county's official history always had. Every one of those sentences was true. None of them was the real reason. The real reason sat under all of them, small and steady and unbearably familiar. I could not afford, professionally or otherwise, to be the registrar who raised an alarm on the eve of the gala that was going to save this collection's funding for the next decade, and mine along with it. The gala opened on a Saturday evening in April, string lights through the old bank lobby, the vault door propped wide so guests could walk through into the exhibit, the way you walk into a story that has already decided how it ends. I remember the room being warm with bodies and candlelight, and I remember Mara at the tin box case in a green dress she had clearly saved for, explaining her family's history to a small circle of guests with a pride I had not seen in her before. And I remember thinking, watching her, that this was the best night the collection had ever had. My hands had gone dry twice already that evening, once during the welcome remarks and once again watching Mara move to the sampler case. And both times I told myself it was simple nerves, the ordinary strain of hosting a room full of donors whose continued goodwill my job now depended on. I did not see her leave the case. I did not see her walk back toward the vault. I only heard, 20 minutes later, over the string quartet and the caterer's clatter, someone ask, in the mild, unworried tone of a party where nothing has yet gone wrong, whether anyone had seen the intern. I went looking before I let myself feel anything about the question, moving through the lobby with the fixed, competent expression I have used at every scene of my career. And it was not until I reached the vault doorway and found it standing open onto darkness that the dryness in my hands became something closer to a ringing in my ears, high and thin and entirely wrong for a room that should have held nothing louder than a humidity gauge. We found her on the floor between the shelving units, breathing, warm, entirely unmarked, and entirely unreachable, her eyes open on a point in the middle distance that nothing in that room could account for. I knelt beside her on the concrete and said her name twice before I understood she was not going to answer it, and somewhere under the panic, underneath the part of me already reaching for my phone to call for help, smaller, colder part of me was doing what it has always done at every scene I have ever knelt at, cataloging. Pupils fixed, no visible trauma, no signs of struggle. The sampler case standing open 3 feet away with nothing missing from it. I hated myself for that instinct, even as I could not stop performing it, and I have never been able to decide whether it made me useless in that moment or the only useful thing left in the room. She has not fully returned since, not in any way her family or her doctors can name in a chart. She sits, mostly, and answers when spoken to in single words that do not connect to what was asked. And her mother, who I still have not been able to look in the eye at the one visit I made, told me in the hallway outside the room that Mara had been accepted, that spring, to a graduate program in public history 2 states away, a scholarship that would have been the first in 3 generations of her family to leave that county for anything but work. She will not be using it. I closed the State Humanities Grant Report the week after the gala, on time, in the format the council prefers, and I remember signing it with a steadiness that frightened me more than anything else had, because I understood, finally and completely, that I was capable of doing the small correct thing in the middle of the largest wrong of my life, and that I had done exactly that, in exactly that order, twice now. I still work at Aldrich County. The board asked me to stay on after the gala, grateful for a centennial exhibit that drew more press and more donor interest than anything the society had produced in decades. And I said yes, because saying no would have meant explaining why, and I have run out of ways to explain why. That do not end with my own name, where Priya's once was. The collection has been quiet since that night. No new gifts, no matched wishes, nothing arriving that I did not ask a normal donor for through normal channels. I do not know if that means it is finished or only resting. I have not tried to find out. I go into the vault most days, past Mara's old desk, which nobody has reassigned, the chipped teapot still sitting where she left it, and I do the ordinary work of a registrar, who is very good at her job, and I do not write a want list anymore. I keep the gaps in my head now, unrecorded, where I hope, without any real confidence, that nothing still reading can reach them. I have not told my director about Priya, and I have not told anyone here about the pattern I saw and chose to keep documenting instead of stopping. And I understand, most days, that the not telling is not privacy. It never was. It is only the same silence, worn into a shape I know how to wear now without it showing. My great-uncle Corwin taught me how to skin a squirrel before I was old enough to be trusted with a pocket knife, and I never once thought there was anything wrong with a boy of 9 standing at his elbow, learning where the fascia gives and where it doesn't. That is the thing about a family trade. It gets into you before you're old enough to consent to it, and by the time you're grown, you can't remember a version of yourself that didn't already know these things. I am a taxidermist. Museum work, mostly. Dioramas for natural history collections. The kind of mounting where the animal has to look like it just stopped moving a half second ago and might start again if you turn away. I am good at it. I was better at it before Sable Hollow. And I want to be honest about that before I tell you anything else, because everything that happened there happened to a version of me that believed his hands were the most trustworthy part of him. Corwin lived alone in the hollow his whole life, in the house his father built and his father's father cleared the land for, 3 ridgelines back from the nearest paved road in Boone County, West Virginia. He ran the family trade out of a workshop attached to the house, a long low room with a dirt floor half covered in ancient plank boards, shelves of specimens going back 4 generations, some of them older than the state itself. I grew up 2 hours from there and visited every summer until I was 17. And then I stopped, and I did not go back for 11 years. And he died alone in that house in the winter, found by a mail carrier 3 weeks after the fact. And I have to tell you that part first, because it is the part that matters most, more than anything with teeth. I stopped going because something happened in that workshop when I was 17 that I could not name then and cannot fully name now. Only that I stood in the doorway one August evening and watched Corwin's hands moving over a fox mount that was not finished, the wire armatures still showing through unfilled sections of hide, and the fox's glass eyes were in, but its mouth was not yet fixed, and I watched his hands go still, and I watched the fox's flank move. Just once, the way a sleeping animal's flank moves, in and out, and I told myself it was the draft from the door I'd just opened. And I never went back after that summer, and I never asked him a single question about it. And now he is gone, and I am the only Cray left who knows how to do this work. Which means the estate lawyer called me in March and asked, gently, if I could come out and catalog the workshop before the county auctioned the land. I said yes because I owed him something. I did not let myself think too hard about what. The drive-in took 4 hours from Baltimore, the last 40 minutes of it on a gravel switchback that ate my tires and my patience in equal measure. And by the time I got the key working in the workshop's warped door frame, it was past 6 in the evening, late April light coming in low and gold through one dusty window, and the smell hit me before anything else did. Clove oil and borax, old varnish, the mineral tang of tanning solution, and underneath all of it, faint and wrong, something floral, jasmine or close to it. My mother wore a jasmine perfume when I was small, before she left, and I remember standing in that doorway thinking absurdly that the smell had followed me 2 hours down a dirt road, just to greet me first. I did not think about it again for 3 days. That is the kind of detail your mind files away as nothing, because nothing about a smell in an old building seems worth examining. And I want you to understand that I am not a superstitious man. I catalog dead things for a living. I have never once believed there was anything left in them by the time they reach my table. The inventory took longer than I expected. Corwin had kept meticulous records in a ledger that went back to 1961, every mount numbered, dated, sold or retained, and cross-referencing his handwritten pages against the physical shelves, I found 11 specimens that existed in the ledger, but not in any completed form on the shelves. 11 unfinished mounts, spread across 63 years, each one begun, and then, according to the ledger's clipped notation, set aside, not abandoned, set aside. The word repeated 11 times in different decades of his handwriting, and each time it was followed by a date. And I noticed, working through the pages by lamplight, with a mug of instant coffee going cold at my elbow, that every set-aside date fell within 2 weeks of a family death, his mother's death, his younger brother's, my own grandfather's, his older brother, in 1988. My father's 11 years ago, which was also, I realized with a small cold drop in my stomach, the year I stopped visiting. I found the fox on the 3rd night, in a back room I hadn't gotten to yet, wrapped in a canvas dropcloth on a workbench of its own, separate from the others. Ledger entry, 1961, Red Fox Vixen, set aside, 63 years unfinished. The same fox. I knew it the way you know your own handwriting, even changed, even older, even under decades of dust. The particular tilt of the skull, the left ear notched where some real animal had lost a fight before it ever came to Corwin's table. I stood there a long time before I pulled the canvas back. It looked exactly as I remembered it from that August evening. The hide filled and mounted, the eyes in, the mouth still not fixed, the wire showing at the gum line where the final stitching had never been done. 63 years, and it had not so much as yellowed. I told myself the workshop's climate control, whatever passed for it, had simply done its job. I have handled specimens far older that survived in far worse conditions than a sealed West Virginia hollow. I told myself this while I was already backing out of the room, and I want to be honest that some part of me knew I was narrating a comfort to myself, rather than reporting a fact. The way you tell a child the noise downstairs is just the house settling, and some part of you believes it precisely because you need to. The next 4 days I worked the front room, cataloging, boxing what could be sold, and every evening around 8 the jasmine smell would return, always strongest near the back room, always gone by the time I walked toward it to check. On the 5th night, I called my sister, mostly because the silence in that house had gotten to be too much company, and she put me on speaker so I could hear her daughter, my niece, arguing with a cartoon character on the television in the background. And Renee laughed at something the toddler said and told me to come home soon. That the hollow had always given her the creeps even as a kid. And for 11 minutes on that call I felt entirely normal, warm in a way I hadn't been since I'd turned onto that gravel road. And when we hung up, I noticed my hands had stopped shaking without my having registered that they'd been shaking at all. That was the last easy night. On the 6th day, I found the second half of the ledger's story, tucked into an inside cover I'd missed. 4 pages in Corwin's father's handwriting, older and harder to read, describing what he called, without any embellishment, the family's arrangement. I will give you the substance of it plainly, because that is how it was written, without drama, the way you'd write down a recipe or a debt owed to a hardware store. Every Cray who takes up the trade takes up, alongside it, an old account, some earlier arrangement. The writing did not say with whom or what, only that it predates any Cray currently living, by which the dead things given proper form under a Cray's hands are permitted to remain, in some diminished fashion, present, rather than simply gone. In exchange, once in a lifetime, the Cray who does the work must finish one true unfinished piece, with their own hand and their own blood mixed into the final seal, and, in doing so, settle the whole accumulated account at once. Skip it. Defer it. Set it aside as my great-grandmother apparently once did for 11 years. And the account does not vanish. It waits on the next Cray, growing, one unfinished piece. Added for each death, the current Cray fails to properly grieve at the workbench, rather than merely at the funeral. 11 unfinished mounts. 11 deaths Corwin had stood in front of, and instead of doing whatever this ritual demanded, had simply set the piece aside and walked away, over and over, for 63 years, until the accumulated weight of it came due on the one death he could not survive to defer again. I remember my mouth going dry reading that page, an ordinary kind of dry, the kind you get from talking too long in a cold room. And I told myself that was all it was. That night the fox moved. I want to describe this the way it actually happened, not the way it feels easier to describe it. Which is to say, I want to resist making it bigger than it was, because the smallness of it is the entire horror. I had gone back to the back room near midnight, telling myself I only wanted one more look at the ledger's earlier pages by better light, and the drop cloth had slipped, half off the fox's back, and in the lamp's angle, its flank was in shadow, and I could not immediately be sure of anything, and I stood there the way you stand very still when you already suspect what stillness will confirm. And its flank moved, in and out, once. The way a sleeping animal's flank moves. It blinked. That was all. I stopped breathing. I do not remember deciding to run the numbers in my head. only that I found myself doing it. Humidity percentage, correct storage temperature for amount of this hide type, the specific gravity of the tanning solution. Corwin favored, reciting inventory figures to myself, the way another man might recite a prayer, because a number is a fact, and a fact was the only thing I had left that could not also be something else. After that first blink, the workshop turned on me by degrees. Not a flood, a slow tightening, the way weather turns before you can name the storm coming. My hands went cold 2 days later, while I worked the ledger and stayed cold. My ears rang faintly whenever I passed within 10 feet of the back room. A high, thin whine I could make stop only by stepping outside into open air. On the 8th night, I woke on the workshop's cot at 3 in the morning, certain I had heard a single cricket click. Once, somewhere close, though there are no crickets alive in April, in that hollow, and none, obviously, among 60 years of preserved specimens on the shelves. I lay there a long time, convincing myself I had dreamed it, the way you convince yourself of anything at 3 in the morning. Because the alternative costs more than you have to spend at that hour. The click came again on the 11th night, twice, and this time I was awake enough to notice. It kept perfect time with my own pulse, not following it, but half a beat ahead, as though something were counting down to an arrival rather than echoing one already there. By the 14th night, my body had stopped arguing with what I already knew. My fingers had gone numb past the first knuckle, and stayed that way for an hour at a stretch. My vision narrowed at its edges whenever I stood too fast. A tunneling I recognized from nowhere good. I understood, the way you understand a diagnosis before the doctor finishes the sentence, that the account was not going to let me finish the inventory and drive home with a truck full of boxed specimens and a check from the county. I understood that I was the only Cray left, and that 11 deaths were waiting on my hands, and that mine would be the 12th if I did not do. Finally, what 4 generations of my family had found some way to set aside. I went to the Fox at 2 in the morning on the 15th night, because I could not make myself wait for daylight to lose its nerve in. I brought Corwin's oldest sealing kit, needle and waxed thread, and the small dark bottle of preservative he'd used my whole childhood, and I sat on the stool where he used to sit, and I finished the mouth. Simple work, the kind I have done 1,000 times on 1,000 other animals. 4 small stitches along the gum line, and at the last stitch, before drawing it closed, I opened my palm with the same needle and let 3 drops fall into the seal before I pulled it shut, the way the ledger's 4th page, in handwriting older than Corwin's father's, said it must be done. I do not have an explanation for what I felt in that moment, only that it was not fear, not by then. It was something closer to relief, the specific relief of a held breath, finally let go, and underneath the relief, immediately, shame, because I understood in the same instant what the relief was actually made of. I was not settling an account for 11 ancestors I never met. I was buying my own way out of a room I was afraid to die in. I told myself afterward, sitting there with my palm throbbing and the fox gone still and ordinary, and simply a fox again, glass-eyed, correctly finished, that I had done something honorable. That was the comfortable version. The true version, which came to me on the drive home the next morning, and has not left since, is that I let an old man die alone in a house at the bottom of a hollow, Because I was afraid of something I saw when I was 17 and never once in 11 years picked up a phone to ask him what it was. And no needle, no thread, no 3 drops of blood into an old seam can settle that particular account. That one is not on the ledger. That one does not come due once and finish. I pay a little of it every night I lie awake, still, listening for a click that keeps almost perfect time with my own pulse, half a beat ahead, patient, in absolutely no hurry at all. I have read 100 fire scenes the way other people read faces. Charred depth tells you how long something burned. Alligatoring tells you how fast. The shape of the burn pattern on a wall, the angle of the V, tells you almost exactly where a fire started. If you are careful and a little bit lucky, whether a person started it. I have stood in the wreckage of 11 structures and told grieving homeowners gently that their space heater did this, or their extension cord did this, or twice, that someone did this to them on purpose. I am good at my job. I want that understood before I tell you the rest, because everything that happened at my aunt's house happened to a woman who trusted her own reading of a burn pattern more than she trusted anything else in the world, and who was right about that trust for 14 years until she was not. I need to tell you about Cutter Ridge first, because you cannot understand what I did later without understanding what I failed to do then. 2 years before my aunt died, I investigated a wildland fire that started in a locked equipment shed on a ranch outside town. The point of origin sat inside a locked door, with a key that had not left the rancher's belt loop. There was no accidental source I could find, no frayed wiring, no stored fuel that made sense of the burn. Everything I had been trained to read told me the word incendiary, but the rancher had a 17-year-old grandson who had been seen near that shed an hour before the smoke. A kid I had gone to the same church as, a kid whose mother worked the register at the pharmacy and always asked about my father. I wrote the cause as undetermined, likely electrical, origin inconclusive. I told myself I was being careful, not soft. 9 weeks later, a different fire. Same county, same strange clean point of origin with no accidental cause behind it. Took a wildland firefighter named Ruiz off a hillside 2 ridges over. I have never been able to prove the 2 fires were related. I have also never been able to stop believing they were, and that the second one was mine to carry, because I had a chance to push harder on the first one, and I let a boy's face stop me. I am telling you this so you understand that when I say I know how a fire behaves, I mean I know it the way you know a person who has hurt you before. I thought that made me safe. It did not make me safe. It made me useful to something in a way I did not understand until it was much too late to matter. My supervisor asked me, the week before I drove up for the estate, whether I wanted the Cutter Ridge file reassigned before I left. Since it was still technically open, pending a records request I kept renewing instead of closing. I told him no. I told him I liked to finish what I started. That was not true, and some part of me knew it was not true even as I said it, standing in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee, because the file had nothing left in it to finish. What I meant, and did not say, was that closing it would mean writing, permanently and in my own hand, the word I had spent 2 years avoiding, and I was not ready to put undetermined into a record I could never revise again. I drove north with that unfinished sentence still open somewhere behind my ribs. The way you carry a held breath through a doorway you are not sure you want to walk through. My Aunt Theodora died in March, in her sleep, in the house she had lived in alone for 40 years on a ridge outside a town, small enough that its fire department was 2 trucks and 11 volunteers. She left me the house in a will that named no one else, though she had a sister, my mother, still living, and a dozen nieces and nephews, closer to her than I had ever bothered to be. I drove up in April to handle the estate, and for 11 miles before I reached her gate, I drove through black. The Ashford Complex fire had come through the ridge the previous September, one of 3 fires that year that made the news for a week and then did not. It had taken 40 homes on that road alone. What was left on either side of the highway was not scenery anymore, just charcoal trunks standing in ash the color of a moth's wing, the ground scorched down past soil into something that looked like it had been fired in a kiln. And then at mile marker 11, without any transition I could account for, the black stopped and the green began, and my aunt's 10 acres sat in the middle of it, like a photograph someone had pasted onto a ruin. The drive itself took something out of me that I had not budgeted for. I have worked burn scars for a living, walked them in full turnout gear, with a clipboard and a job to do. And I had never simply driven through one at 40 miles an hour with nothing to occupy my hands. 11 miles of standing char does not look like a photograph of disaster. It looks like a held note that will not resolve. Mile after mile of trunks stripped down to their black skeletons. Chimneys standing alone in cleared lots where houses used to be. The guardrails along the shoulder warped soft in places from heat that had briefly made steel behave like something else. A single mailbox, somehow untouched, stood at the end of a gravel drive that led to nothing but a foundation and a set of stone porch steps going up into open air. I did not cry. I want to say I did not cry, because I am used to this. But the truth is I had gone somewhere, flat and quiet inside myself, the place I go at every scene, and I did not come back out of it until the color changed. I want to be exact about what I saw, because exactness is the only thing I have ever been able to offer anyone. Her fence line was intact for the full perimeter of the property, cedar posts unscorched, and outside that fence line, for as far as I could see in either direction, there was nothing standing taller than a foot. The demarcation was not gradual. It did not feather out the way real fire behavior feathers, weakening with distance from fuel, catching here and skipping there, according to wind and moisture, and 100 small physical facts. It was a line. It looked drawn. The old part of me, the part that gets paid to explain fire scenes to insurance adjusters, told me this was defensible space done well. 100 feet of cleared brush and irrigated grass, doing exactly what it is supposed to do, and a wind shift at the right hour, doing the rest. I believed that explanation for about 4 days. I want you to know I tried to keep believing it. I am a professional. I do not chase ghosts. I chase char depth and V patterns and the physical provable behavior of flame against fuel. And for 4 days that was enough. On the first evening I met Hollis Brocht, who farmed the parcel, adjoining my aunt's land on the north side, close enough that from my aunt's porch I could see the blackened footprint of his old barn, which the same fire had taken whole. He came by with a casserole his wife had made before she passed. He said, a recipe she used to bring to every new arrival on the ridge, and he stayed on the porch with me until the light went out of the sky, talking about my aunt with a kind of plain, unhurried grief that made me trust him immediately. He told me she used to bring him tomatoes every August, more than any one household could eat, and that she had once driven 40 minutes into town in a snowstorm because his wife, still living then, had run out of a medication and could not go herself. He talked about her the way you talk about someone who was simply, reliably good, without needing the word good to carry any weight beyond itself. And I found myself grateful for a version of my aunt I had never bothered to learn while she was alive to tell me about it. His son Cody, 14 and quiet in the particular way of boys who have lost a parent too young, sat on the porch step and fed my aunt's cat table scraps and did not say much, but he laughed once at something his father said about a goat that used to get into Theodora's garden, and it was such an easy, ordinary sound that I remember thinking, sitting there, that this was the first evening in longer than I wanted to admit that I had felt entirely safe. The coffee was too strong. Hollis apologized for it twice, and the second time Cody rolled his eyes in a way that told me this was a running joke between them, worn smooth with repetition, the kind of small family ritual that survives even when half the family does not. Somewhere past the tree line a nightjar was calling, and the air smelled like wood smoke that was 2 seasons old and mostly gone, and underneath it, close and clean like rosemary. I remember thinking, before I knew enough to think anything else, that I would like to come back to this porch again. I did not yet understand that I was already going to. She had rosemary planted at all 4 corners of the property, thick woody bushes gone waist-high, the kind that take a decade of neglect to get that size. I noticed it because rosemary does not usually survive drought the way it had clearly survived up here, gray-green and glossy, even at the edge of a burn scar. Hollis noticed me noticing it. He said, "My aunt tended those bushes like they were the only thing on the property that mattered, out at each corner post every week without fail, and when I asked him why, he shrugged and said, some people just love a particular plant, and something in the way he said it told me he did not fully believe his own answer, and did not want to say the true one out loud on a dead woman's porch. That night I found a letter in her writing desk, addressed to me in handwriting I recognized from birthday cards I had not answered in years. It was not long. She wrote that she was glad I would have the house, that she hoped I would keep the garden, and near the bottom, in a line I read 4 times, before I understood she meant it literally. She wrote, "The line holds if you tend it. Always the rosemary, at every post, every season, even when it feels foolish, especially then." I told myself it was an old woman's superstition about drought-hardy plants, the kind of private ritual lonely people build to give their days a shape. I put the letter in a drawer. I did not, that night, believe it was an instruction. For the next several days, I did what I always do at a scene, which is to say, I could not stop myself from documenting it. I told myself I was doing it for the insurance claim, or out of professional habit, or because grief needed somewhere to go and cataloging was the only language grief, and I have ever agreed on. I walked the fence line with a notebook and a char depth gauge I had brought without admitting to myself why, and what I found did not fit anything I had 15 years of training to explain. I started at the southwest corner, the way I start every scene, working the fence in one continuous direction, so I would not double back and second-guess my own first readings. I took depth measurements every 20 feet, the way NFPA guidance recommends for a perimeter survey, and log them in the same clipped shorthand I use on every job. Depth, angle, fuel type, wind exposure. For the first 30 feet, the numbers looked ordinary. A normal gradient of scorch weakening as it moved away from continuous fuel. Then the numbers stopped gradienting. They held steady, identical, for the next 200 feet, as if someone had drawn the burn with a compass, instead of letting a fire decide it for itself. I checked my gauge against a second reading by hand, running my thumb along the blackened grass just past the fence line, and found the same abrupt, unnatural edge every fire investigator learns to distrust on sight. Because real fire does not have edges. Real fire has arguments. This had a verdict. The burn pattern outside my aunt's fence did not simply stop at the property line, the way defensible space burns stop, weakening gradually as fuel thins. It curved. It followed the fence at a consistent 18 inches for the entire perimeter, an almost surveyed distance, tight around every post, every gate. Every place where a gap in cleared brush should have let flame lean inward. Fire does not measure itself against a fence line like that. Wind does not respect property boundaries with a ruler. I stood at the northeast corner post, where the rosemary was thickest, and traced the curve of scorched earth with my finger, and felt, for the first time since Cutter Ridge, the specific cold of a fact I did not want to be a fact. I told myself it was wind shadow. Fences create wind shadow. Wind shadow can affect ember cast. I had seen stranger things explained by terrain funneling before. I wrote wind shadow in my notebook in block letters, underlined it, and felt the relief of an explanation land in my chest like a held breath finally let go. I believed it for 2 more days. I believed it right up until the afternoon Hollis mentioned, almost as an aside, over coffee on my aunt's porch again, that the ridge had burned 6 times in the last 100 years by his family's count, and Theodora's line, his words, had never once been touched. Not in the big one in 58, not in the Ashford complex last fall. He said it the way you say something you have decided not to examine too closely. And when I asked what he meant by never touched, something, he said, always burns instead. He did not elaborate. Cody, on the step, went very still and did not look up from the cat. That was the first snap, though I did not have the word for it yet, because the word came from a training manual. And this did not feel like anything a manual had prepared me for. Something always burns instead. I thought of the barn footprint I could see from the porch. I thought of 40 homes on 11 miles of highway, and one green rectangle sitting in the middle of the ash like an exemption nobody had signed, but somebody had clearly been paying for. I did not leave. I want to be honest about that, because leaving is the sane thing, and I did not do the sane thing. And the reason I did not do it is the same reason I write cause and origin reports for a living. I needed to know. I told myself I was investigating, the way I investigate everything, methodically, with a gauge and a notebook, and that knowing would let me decide rationally what to do with the property. I did not tell myself the other reason, which was that some part of me, the part still standing in a locked shed 2 years earlier, wanted very badly to find a fire pattern that made sense this time, one I could read all the way to the end without flinching. The Kestrel fire started 9 days after I arrived, 11 miles east, in dry grass along a transmission corridor, and by the second afternoon it had crossed 2 ridgelines and put the whole valley under a pre-evacuation warning. I watched the column build from my aunt's porch, the color of a bruise going yellow at the edges, and felt my hands go dry and my mouth go drier, and did the thing I have done at every fire scene of my adult life, which is reach for competence instead of fear. I called a fire captain I knew from a joint investigation 3 years back, told him I had property on the ridge and credentials that might be useful, and asked to be embedded with Incident Command as an observer. He said yes faster than I expected. Departments are always short-handed during a complex, and a licensed cause and origin investigator with local knowledge of the terrain is not a resource anyone turns down. I told myself this was the responsible thing to do. I told myself I could help. I believed standing in that command tent with a radio clipped to my collar for the first time in 2 years that I had finally found a fire I could get ahead of, instead of one I would spend the rest of my life explaining after the fact. That was the second warm, and it was the most dangerous one, because it wore the shape of redemption instead of comfort. The command tent smelled like diesel and cold coffee, and the particular ozone tang of radios running too hot, and I stood at the map table between 2 men I had worked with before. My collar radio squawking traffic I had not heard live in 2 years, and felt something in my chest unclench that I had not known was clenched. This was the work. This was the version of myself who arrived before the damage instead of after it, who read the terrain instead of the ruins. And for the first time since Cutter Ridge, I let myself believe I had earned my way back into that version without qualification. When the incident commander laid out the planned burnout operation, a controlled backfire meant to rob the main fire of fuel along a ridge road, I looked at the map and saw that the line they had drawn would leave my aunt's parcel exposed on its eastern flank, the one side without her rosemary at the corner, the one side I had never fully walked. My hands were dry again, the way they had gone dry watching the column build from the porch. And I told myself the dryness was smoke, not fear, and both times I was lying to myself in exactly the same voice. I argued for moving the line a quarter-mile east, citing defensible space, historical survival data, terrain funneling, every true and professional word I had, and none of them the real reason, which I could not have said out loud in a command tent without sounding like the thing I had spent my whole career refusing to become. The commander pushed back once, said the revised line. Put more structures inside the burnout corridor, and I remember answering him with a confidence I had not felt in 2 years, telling him the terrain data supported it, watching him nod and reach for his pen, because I was, after all, the credentialed investigator, standing at his table with local knowledge he did not have. They moved the line. I signed the revision myself, my signature small and steady at the bottom of a page. I did not read past the paragraph that mattered to me. I felt, in that moment, more competent than I had felt in 2 years, and I did not let myself notice, until it no longer mattered, that the parcel now left exposed on the new line was Hollis Bracht's. I found out 3 hours later, standing at the new containment point with a radio in my hand, that the burnout had jumped exactly where the fence line curved back toward the Bracht property, in a wind nobody on the crew could explain, funneling not away from my aunt's rosemary, but toward the one structure adjacent to it that still had a roof. I heard it on the radio before I understood it. A structure fire called in on Brock's parcel, and I was already running before the second call came through. The one asking if anyone had eyes on the boy, because Hollis had gone back for the dog, and Cody had gone back for Hollis, and neither of them had checked in. I do not remember most of the next hour in order. I remember my mouth going dry the way it had gone dry twice before, except this time there was no rational category left to file it under. No wind shadow, no terrain funneling, nothing my training could hand me to make the dryness mean something other than what it meant. I remember the radio traffic going from routine to clipped in the space of a single transmission. A voice I did not recognize saying spot fire, structure involved. And then, a few minutes later, the words that emptied everything else out of me, asking for eyes on the boy. I ran the access road on foot because the truck I had come in was blocked by two engines angled across the gravel. And I remember the specific, ordinary pain of gravel through the soles of shoes that were not built for it, because some part of my mind was still cataloging, still doing the job, even as the rest of me came apart. I remember the smell of my own hands, rosemary and ash both, from where I had been gripping the fence rail at my aunt's corner post an hour before, and I remember it rising off my skin at the worst possible moment. Mid-run, mid-radio call, wrong, completely wrong. The smell of a garden in the middle of the only night of my life that mattered least like a garden. I remember thinking, with a clarity that still embarrasses me, that I still owed my supervisor the Cutter Ridge follow-up paperwork, 3 years overdue, and that if I did not survive the next hour, someone else would have to close that file, and I could not decide, running toward a structure fire that was not supposed to exist on that line, whether that thought was mercy or cowardice. I have never been able to decide. What I can tell you is that it stayed with me the whole way down that road. Small and stupid and steady, a single flat fact refusing to be crowded out by anything larger. The way a held breath will fix itself on one point of light in a dark room, simply because it needs somewhere safe to look. Cody was found 40 minutes later, past the tree line behind his father's collapsed barn footprint, alive, burned along one arm, and the side of his face, badly enough that I am told the recovery took the better part of a year. Hollis got him that far, and then could not get either of them farther, and Hollis did not walk away from that hillside. I was there when they brought him down. I will not describe it. Some things I have learned belong only to the people who carried them, and I was not one of the people carrying. Only one of the people who had, 3 hours earlier, moved a line on a map with a pen that felt, at the time, like the most responsible object I had ever held. The fire never touched my aunt's fence. Not the rosemary at the corners, not the cedar posts, not the green rectangle sitting in the black like it always had. I walked the perimeter 2 days later with my gauge, out of habit, and found the same 18-inch curve of scorched earth I had found weeks before, unbroken, patient, exactly measured, as if the property had simply continued, doing what it had always done, while a quarter-mile east. Something else had been asked to do it instead. I have thought a great deal since about the difference between what happened to me at Cutter Ridge and what happened here. At Cutter Ridge, I failed by omission, by softness, by looking at a boy's face and choosing not to see what the burn pattern was telling me. I have spent 2 years believing that was the worst kind of failure a person in my position could commit. I know better now. At Cutter Ridge I did nothing, and a man I never met died on a hillside I never walked. Here I did something. I picked up a pen with my own steady, trained, competent hand and moved a line on a map, because I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to be the kind of investigator who gets ahead of the fire instead of arriving after it, and a 14-year-old boy will carry the mark of that competence on the side of his face for the rest of his life, and his father will not carry anything at all, anywhere, ever again. I closed the Cutter Ridge file the month after I came back down off the ridge. I wrote incendiary, undetermined subject in the box I had left blank for 2 years, and I felt nothing like the relief I had imagined feeling. I understand the difference now between the two failures, in a way I could not have explained to anyone before that spring. Cutter Ridge was a door I did not open. Kestrel was a door I opened myself, with my own hand, certain I was letting in safety, and not understanding until the smoke cleared that safety for one house had always meant danger for another, and that I had simply been the one who finally put my name to which house would be which. I did not sell the house. I have thought about it more times than I can count, and each time I picture striking a match to it myself instead, and each time I stop, because burning it would be its own kind of running, a way of pretending the debt belongs to the property and not to me. It never belonged to the property. I understand that now. The line only ever holds because someone tends it, and someone else, somewhere close by, pays for the tending without ever being told they were asked. I go out to the corner posts every week, the way she did, the way the letter told me to, and I do not know anymore whether I am honoring my aunt or volunteering. Again, for the next name I will not choose. I tend the rosemary anyway. I have not found a version of myself brave enough to stop. Somewhere in a box in my closet, there is a pillowcase I have never been able to throw away, and until 3 months ago, I did not understand why. It is not hers. I want to be clear about that from the very beginning, because it matters later. It only looks like it could be. Hey there. However heavy the day has been, you can lay that weight down now, just for a while, just for me. You have carried enough for one day, and there is nothing left to prove tonight. What I have for you is old and quiet, and it moves the way old houses move, slow, in the dark, one board at a time. Let your eyes close whenever they want to. I will still be here when they do. I spent 3 years as the overnight caretaker and historical interpreter at the Moore House in Villisca, Iowa, the same house where, in the early hours of June the 10th, 1912, someone took an axe to a family of 6 and 2 visiting children while they slept, and was never caught, never named, never made to answer for it in any court that stuck. I want you to understand what that job actually was, because it is not what people assume. I did not dress up. I did not perform. I sat with guests through the night, by lamplight only, no electricity permitted inside the original structure, and I told them the truth as the historical record has it, which is considerably stranger and considerably sadder than anything I could have invented. I took the job because I needed a place where facts still meant something, and I want to be honest about why that mattered to me so much. Because it is the whole reason the house eventually found me the way it did. 4 years before I started, my younger sister, Callie, walked out of our house in Council Bluffs one October evening to meet a friend 2 streets over, and she never arrived, and she was never found. I was 19. I spent 2 years of my life organizing search parties, printing flyers, sitting in police stations asking for updates that never came, and somewhere in the middle of the second year, I was the one who told my parents it was time to let the searching stop. I called it mercy. I have never once, until 4 months ago, let myself examine whether it was actually something closer to running out of road. The Moore house gave me a version of that unfinished feeling I could hold at arm's length, study, explain to strangers by lamplight, and hand back at dawn. That distance was the whole appeal. I was good at the job precisely because I trusted facts over feeling, and a museum built around an unsolved murder needs someone who can say, calmly and without flinching, here is what we actually know, and here is where the record simply stops. I told that to every group of guests who paid to spend the night in the children's room where 4 of the 8 victims were found. I believed it completely. I want that on the record too, because it makes what happened afterward considerably harder to explain away. The house itself is small, 2 stories, white clapboard, restored down to the doorknobs, and it sits on a quiet residential street in a town of about 1,000 people, the kind of town where everyone still knows exactly which house you mean without you needing to give the address. Inside, there is no electric light at all, only coal oil lamps that guests carry room to room, and the smell of a trimmed wick catching slightly crooked, throwing a thin curling ribbon of smoke that smells faintly like burnt hair and old varnish, is a smell I have never encountered anywhere else in my life, and I do not expect to. Every mirror in the house is either removed or covered, a detail original to the crime scene itself, since whoever killed that family covered every mirror in the house before leaving, a fact investigators noted in 1912 and have never once been able to explain. I told that detail to guests almost every single night, standing in the downstairs parlor with a lamp raised just enough to show the shape of a covered mirror above the mantel, and I always said the same line, that we do not know why the mirrors were covered, and anyone who tells you they do know is selling you something. I meant it as reassurance. I have come to understand it rather differently since. The floorboards in the upstairs children's room have a particular sound when you walk them, and I want to describe it precisely because it becomes important later. The third board from the door, walked at a certain angle, produces a 2-part creak, a low groan followed by a higher, almost singing note a half-second behind it. The kind of sound old wood makes when it has settled into exactly one comfortable position and resents being asked to hold any weight at all. I noticed it my first week on the job and thought nothing of it beyond noting it for guests who startled at the sound in the dark. It was only months later, lying awake in my own apartment, that I placed where I had heard that exact 2-part creak before, which was the 3rd floorboard in the hallway outside Callie's bedroom door, back in Council Bluffs. The board I used to test every single night of her teenage years, to check whether she had snuck back in after curfew, low groan, then that higher singing note, and I would know she was home and safe before I ever opened her door. For most of my first 2 years at the house, nothing about the job frightened me in any way that mattered. Guests reported things, of course, the way guests at any reputedly haunted site always do. Cold spots, the sensation of being watched. Occasionally, the local legend itself, that if you stay awake past 12:30 in the morning, close to the estimated hour of the killings, you may hear a rhythmic, wet sort of sound coming from the children's room upstairs. I heard variations of that story from dozens of paying guests over 2 years, and I always gave them the same honest answer, that the museum itself has never verified it, that old houses settle and creak at all hours, and that human beings primed by darkness and true crime tend to hear pattern in noise the same way they see faces in static. I believed every word of that answer completely. I still believe most of it now. It was on a quiet Tuesday in February, in the 4th month before I am telling you this, that the pattern started to change in ways that no longer fit inside my explanations, and I want to walk you through exactly how it happened. One small piece at a time, the way I lived it, because that is the only honest way to tell you how a person loses their footing on ground they have spent 3 years insisting was solid. The first small thing happened with a mirror. I had a private overnight booking that Tuesday, a single guest, a paranormal researcher named Dana, who had stayed at the house twice before and always behaved professionally, setting up her recording equipment quietly and never once treating the murdered family as entertainment, which I respected. We walked the house together at dusk, lamp in hand, and I gave her the same tour I had given hundreds of times before, ending in the parlor with the covered mirror above the mantel. The same line about how we do not know why the mirrors were covered, and anyone who claims certainty is selling something. Dana nodded, set up a small audio recorder on the mantel beneath that same covered mirror, and we said goodnight around 11, each retreating to our separate, assigned rooms for the evening. I woke a little after 1 in the morning to the sound of Dana's footsteps on the stairs, quick and uneven in a way that did not match her usual careful pace. When I met her in the hallway, lamp raised, her face had the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to look as frightened as they feel. She told me, in a voice kept deliberately level, that the mirror above the mantel was uncovered. I told her, just as levelly, that this was almost certainly explained by a loose pin or a draft, working the cloth free over the course of an evening, the kind of thing that happens in a 113-year-old house, with settling walls and imperfect fixtures. We walked back down together, and I recovered the mirror myself, checking the pins twice, and I want to be honest and tell you that in that moment, standing in lamplight in front of an uncovered mirror, in the exact room where a killer once covered every reflective surface in the house for reasons no one has ever explained, I felt afraid in a way that had nothing to do with my mind and everything to do with the base of my spine, a cold that started there and climbed. That was the cold. My explanation about pins and drafts was the warm. I believed it right up until I pinned the cloth back myself and felt for just a moment that the fabric did not want to stay. Dana left the next morning without incident, thanked me, and booked a follow-up visit for April that she later canceled without explanation. I filed the mirror incident away as exactly the kind of thing that happens at old sites with high-strung guests and settling architecture, and for 3 weeks nothing else occurred that I could not immediately place inside that same rational frame. I want you to understand that I was not looking for anything unusual during that period. If anything, I was actively looking away from it. The same careful, deliberate looking away I had perfected 4 years earlier. In the second year of searching for my sister, when I started letting myself believe that closing a case was the same thing as mercy. The second small thing happened at the end of February, and it involved the floorboard. I was walking the upstairs hallway alone, well after guests had settled for the night, doing my usual rounds with the lamp, when I heard the two-part creak low groan. Then that higher singing note coming from behind me, from the closet at the end of the hall. I want to be precise about why this stopped me completely in my tracks. That particular creak belongs only to the third floorboard in the children's room, a board I have walked thousands of times and know the exact register of the way you know a family member's voice through a closed door. The hallway closet has no exposed floorboards at all, only a solid level plank subfloor installed during a 1980s renovation, decades after the murders. And there is no possible mechanical way for that specific two-part creak to originate from underneath a sealed plank surface. I stood very still in that hallway for what felt like a long time, lamp raised, listening for it again, and it did not repeat. I told myself, and I want you to hear how carefully I constructed this, that sound travels strangely through old timber-framed houses, that a creak from the actual children's room floorboard could easily have traveled through the frame and seemed to an already unsettled listener to originate somewhere it had not. I have a graduate degree in a history-adjacent field, and I have given tours about acoustics and old house mechanics for 3 years. And I made myself believe that explanation completely the way I have made myself believe every explanation I have ever needed to keep functioning. That was the warm again, arriving right on schedule to smooth over the cold. It was that same week, in the middle of all this quiet unraveling, that I had one good hour I want to tell you about, because it happened, and it mattered, and I do not want to build this story only out of dread. A retired school teacher named Ruth, one of the volunteer docents, who covered daytime tours, brought a thermos of hot cider into the visitor center on a bitter February afternoon and poured me a cup without asking, just set it in my cold hands and told me I looked like I needed it more than she did. I stood there in the unheated visitor center, holding that warm cup, watching steam curl up past my face, and for maybe 10 minutes I felt nothing but the simple, ordinary comfort of a stranger's small kindness. It did not last. Nothing in this story lasts. But it happened, and I want it on the record, because the warmth of that cup is precisely what made the cold that came after feel so much colder by comparison. By early March, I had stopped being able to fully explain away what was happening, though I still had not permitted myself to say so out loud, not even to myself in the privacy of my own head. I had, by that point, more than enough evidence to know that something in that house was responding specifically to me, and not merely to the general presence of overnight guests, the way the legend had always described it. But I was not yet willing to name what that meant. This is the part I need you to sit with, because it is the part that took me the longest to understand afterward. The gap between knowing and admitting is not empty space. It is where the real work of the house was happening quietly. The entire time I was busy constructing explanations. The third small thing, and the one that finally broke my ability to look away, Happened on a night in mid-March when I had no guests booked at all, an entirely private evening I had scheduled simply to catch up on inventory and maintenance records by lamplight, alone in a house that, according to the house's own established legend, only produces its rhythmic 12:30 sound when overnight guests are present to hear it. I want to be exact about the timeline here because precision is the only thing I have left that I still trust completely. At 12:28 in the morning, alone with no guests booked, no recording equipment running, nothing but myself and a lamp in the downstairs parlor, I heard it. A rhythmic, wet sound coming from directly above me, from the children's room, exactly matching the description dozens of guests had given me over 3 years. A description I had spent 3 years politely, professionally, and completely sincerely dismissing. I did not run. I want you to know that, because everything about who I am tells me fear this large does not always look like fleeing. I climbed the stairs, lamp shaking slightly in my hand, and the sound continued the entire way up. Not slowing, not pausing, simply repeating that same wet rhythm until I reached the children's room door and the sound stopped completely. The instant my hand touched the frame, I stood in the doorway a long moment. The room was exactly as it always is. 4 small beds, a covered mirror on the far wall, nothing disturbed. It was the floorboard, the third one from the door, that I noticed then, because a corner of pale fabric was tucked beneath its edge where no fabric had ever been before. And I knelt down, lamp trembling now in a way I could not steady, and pulled it free. It was a pillowcase, small, a child's size, printed with a faded floral pattern I did not recognize and could not place. And I sat on the floor of that room for what must have been several minutes, simply holding it before I understood, with a plainness that arrived far too calmly for what it actually meant, that I had never seen this object before in my life, and yet some part of my body recognized it the way you recognize your own hand. I took the pillowcase home with me that night, against every rule of professional conduct I had followed for 3 years, and I have never told the museum's director that I did so. I want that on the record as well. The gap between what I already knew and what I was willing to name had, by that point, nearly closed entirely, and I did not close it that night either. I lay awake in my own apartment with the pillowcase on the chair beside my bed, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, unable to sleep, I found myself doing something I had not done in years. Running through the floor plan of my childhood house in my mind, room by room, the exact creak of the third hallway floorboard outside Callie's door, the specific slant of afternoon light through her curtains, the sound her window made when she used to prop it open in summer. It was not comforting. It was the mind reaching sideways for something small and manageable, while something far larger sat, unexamined, in the room beside the bed. I went back to the house the following week determined to find a rational origin for the pillowcase. And I want to walk you through what I actually found, because it is the piece of evidence that finally forced the gap closed. I searched the museum's donation records, the inventory of period textiles acquired over decades of restoration work, and I found nothing matching that floral pattern anywhere in the official collection. I called the director, framed it as a general inventory question, and was told, without hesitation, that no pillowcase of that description had ever been cataloged, purchased, or donated to the house. I sat with that answer a long time before I made myself do the next thing, which was drive 4 hours back to Council Bluffs, to my parents' house, to the closed box in my old bedroom closet that I had not opened since I was 19 years old. I want to be careful here, because this is the moment where the story stops being about a haunted house and starts being about something the house apparently already understood about me before I did. In that box, among Callie's old things my mother could never bring herself to give away, there was a photograph I had forgotten existed. Callie at perhaps 8 years old, sitting up in her bed in our old house, and in her arms, held against her chest, the way a child holds something they refuse to be parted from, was a pillowcase with a faded floral pattern, sewn by our grandmother, that Callie had insisted on keeping long after every other pillowcase in the house had been replaced. It was not the same physical object. I need you to understand that clearly, because I have turned this over more times than I can count, and I refuse to let myself claim more certainty than the facts allow. It was not the same object. It was, in every visible detail, identical to it. I drove back to Villisca that same night, 4 hours in the dark, with that photograph on the passenger seat beside me. And I understood, somewhere around the halfway point of that drive, what the house had actually been doing to me for 3 years, which was never haunting me in the sense that word usually means. It had been waiting, patiently, the way old houses wait, for me to bring the one thing I had never once allowed myself to look at directly into a room built specifically to hold what happens when someone stops looking too soon. I arrived back at the house a little before midnight and let myself in with my own key, alone, the way I had done hundreds of times before, except this time I did not carry a lamp past the parlor. I climbed the stairs in the dark, the pillowcase from the closet in one hand, the photograph in the other, and I sat down on the floor of the children's room, in front of the covered mirror, and I waited for 12:30 the way I had spent 3 years teaching other people to wait for it, except this time I was not there to explain the sound away. The rhythmic wet sound began exactly on schedule, and this time I did not flinch from it, and this time, for the first time in 3 years, I reached up and pulled the cloth from the mirror myself. I did not see a monster. I want you to understand that, because I think some part of me had spent 3 years secretly, hoping the horror would arrive as something I could point to and name and therefore be finished with. What I saw, in the low, uneven lamplight I had left burning downstairs, was simply my own reflection, except that, behind my shoulder, faint and steady and entirely still, stood the shape of a young woman I have not seen with my own eyes in 8 years. Not accusing, not reaching, simply present, the way a person is present when they have been waiting a very long time to be looked at directly. I did not scream. I sat very still on that floor, and I said her name out loud for the first time in 8 years. And I told her I was sorry, that I should have kept looking, that calling it mercy had mostly been about what I could no longer bear to carry rather than what she actually deserved. And the reflection did not move or answer, only remained patient, the way the house itself had remained patient with every guest who had ever slept there, waiting for someone to admit that some debts are never actually closed, only abandoned by the person who owed them. The rhythmic sound stopped. The reflection, when I finally made myself look again, was only my own. I sat on that floor for a long time afterward, the pillowcase in my lap, understanding with a plainness that felt almost merciful in its simplicity, that the house had never wanted to frighten me away. It had wanted, in whatever slow and patient logic a building holds, when it has spent over a century keeping a story open that the world outside insists on trying to close, to make sure that at least one person who walked through it at night understood exactly what it costs to declare a search finished before it actually is. I still work at the house, though I have changed the way I speak to guests about the covered mirrors. I no longer tell them we simply do not know why they were covered. I tell them instead that some things are covered because the truth underneath them was never actually resolved, only hidden from view by the people who could not bear to keep looking at it, and I let the guests draw whatever comfort or unease from that they need to. I have not stopped searching for what happened to Callie. I want to be honest and tell you that I do not expect, at this point, to ever find an answer, and I have made a kind of peace with carrying that absence rather than pretending it has closed. Some nights, walking the upstairs hallway alone with my lamp, I still hear the third floorboard sing its low groan and higher note, and I no longer flinch from it. I have come to understand it. Instead, as a kind of appointment I intend to keep for as long as I am asked to. The way I understand now that I owe someone a debt that permission was never mine to declare paid. The pillowcase still sits in a drawer in my apartment. Some nights I take it out and hold it, not because it comforts me, though in some limited way it does, but because I have finally stopped pretending that the searching was ever something I had the right to end on my own.